Held up. Right, yeah, sorry about that, folks. I just forgot to set up the recording. Right. Okay, so Water Quarry Limited identified this as alternative source, which they believe was in the groundwater. And it's actually plausible. I've been to one of the outlet points on this, and I have smelt this in close proximity. However, the reports left it completely unanswered what the magnitude of that contribution was relative to the actual landfill site itself. But to give you a bit of a sense of perspective on this, Water Quarry Limited, they monitored the headspace above where the groundwater is pumped out, and they were monitoring 53, and they were finding 53 parts per million hydrogen sulfide there. If we go back to their, I think, March gas, where they actually monitored from the gas wells, there was 10,000 parts per million coming out of their gas wells. And that was because the instrument had maxed out and they were using carbon filters to attenuate that to avoid damage to the meter. So yes, the alternative source is plausible. Is it plausible to explain what we're all experiencing? No chance. And also the funny thing is they criticise the Coal Authority for using improper instruments and then that weren't sensitive enough, and then use the same instruments to justify their own measurements, which I thought was hilarious. And also, those familiar with Silverdale, we've got the mine water treatment facility, the other side of the railway. And that's like a waterfall of water that's pumped out of the mines and allowed to settle. And if that really was the credible source to explain the majority of this, the epicenter would be that in Silverdale, and it just isn't. So this, to us, this looked just like a deflection. So the likely source, of course, is unauthorised gypsum deposits in the landfill. Up until the 1st of April 2009, this was permitted up to 10% of the waste. But beyond that, absolutely no, you cannot mix gypsum with biodegradable waste. And if you're going to dispose of gypsum, you've got to have a dedicated cell that's kept completely separated. And this, from the 29th of March, I've said that this is the problem. And finally, the Environment Agency admitted this in legal paperwork to Messrs. Hockin, Murray, Bestine, and they said that they consider the cause as unauthorised acceptance of waste containing gypsum. So our theory was ultimately corroborated. Right, so how does hydrogen sulfide smell? How does it get generated? Well, you've heard of the fire triangle where you need oxygen, heat, and fuel to sustain a fire. Well, I've developed the hydrogen sulfide triangle. Well, and our electron microscope is down there. We'll attest that that's exactly what sulfate-reducing bacteria looks like if you look under a microscope. But what they need to survive is water. They need damp environments, but it's raining, so they've got plenty of that. You need high sulfate waste, so that's gypsum mainly, and you also need biodegradable matter. And when it digests all these materials, it produces hydrogen sulfide, which is the gas you can all smell. So what's been done so far to try and keep this hydrogen sulfide in the landfill itself? Proven so far, they've put about 70% of the site is now capped, including a proprietary posi-shell material, which is spray-on. 28 gas extraction wells are currently being dug. There's telemetry has been added to the gas management system, so they know what volumes of gas they're capturing, and from their simulations, they can then figure out how much they're losing. And they've also put trialing a new carbon in the filters, because the gas, before you burn it, you do have to treat it, because you can produce excess sulfur dioxide if you don't. And also it rots the gas engines that generate electricity. So they were using flares up until recently. However, for me, the story doesn't end here, because the Environment Agency are telling us that new waste does not contribute to the problem. But what we have here is, let's say the Environment Agency have already admitted that there's unauthorised gypsum waste in the site. And we know from the fact that rainwater, as it passes through, generates leachate, because it dissolves biodegradable material and holds it in suspension. So we know that the water mixes the biodegradable material. So even if the Environment Agency's assurances are correct, there's no new gypsum waste coming into the site, as the rainwater percolates through the new waste, it carries those biodegradable particles down into the old waste, sustaining that sulfate reducing bacteria and contributing to the problem. So I have challenged the Environment Agency on this, and they are looking into it, and they say the proof is on them. The proof is on us to prove that this is contributing to pollution. Well, health is at risk. You take the conservative approach to this. It's on, and I say it's on them to prove to us that this isn't happening, and I'll gladly accept it if that proof is provided. But so far, it's not forthcoming. So my sort of recommendation is, should we start considering to change the permit to inert waste only? The site does need to be filled. You can't just cap it as it says. It would flood. It would breach the leachate liner. It would be awful if you just stopped now. So, but to bring it up to height with inert waste, I think that is the way forward. And one thing that I don't want you to forget is that things have got better, but it's us, it's the citizens and the community of Selfregulation that actually drove this. From Mark doing his initial monitoring to everyone doing their research, everyone that submitted a complaint to the EA. We've driven this change, not the Environment Agency. They'd have happily just sat by and let this happen to us. And to just imagine where we would be. Yep. Got questions, Steve?
I have, yes. One that we can't answer. How does the Environment Agency check that there's no more gypsum going in?
They audited the procedures. Yes, they've audited the procedures. So they trust Warren's Quarry Limited to be doing the checks correctly. Absolutely. and so what we continue, and what we can do as a community is continue to learn and drive the change for the better, because we don't want this in a few months' time to be following the red route. We still want it to be following the green route, and the status quo still isn't acceptable. So everything you've done so far, thank you, but we really need to get behind this and hold everyone to account. Okay, and that's the end of my very short presentation. Thanks for listening, and have you got any questions? Hello.
How many gas wells are actually in operation now?
In operation, sorry, on Zoom, the question was, how many gas wells are in operation now? It was 55. They're drilling another 28, but there's a bit of ambiguity as to whether some of them are a re-drill rather than a new drill. I believe that the total when they finish this round of drilling should be 77.
Which will be
End of this month, I think. Yeah. Yes, Joe.
That's right, what you mean, and all the scientists and all the experts. I'm a bit concerned regarding this weather, the winter time. The airborne particles. I know what that we're doing, reading the airborne, the molecules and so forth. Can you explain what's happening now?
With the sort of particulate matter.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah. Joe's question for those on Zoom was regarding what will happen with particulate matter going into the winter. Now, I can't really answer that. It's not my specialism. However, we have imported a surrogate southerner who will be explaining in about an hour and a half's time what will be happening with those. So I will defer that question. Oh.
Where does the book stop? If the EA say they haven't got this, they will that, they will the other person. Who has got the ultimate power to do something?
the ultimate, the question was, who's got the ultimate power to do something constructive? Yes, it is ultimately the Right Honourable George Eustace MP. He's, as the Secretary of State, he has completely overarching powers on this. And so if anyone fancies writing a letter, please do, fill his inbox, give him a hard time, because ultimately, yes, there was some questions in the past about which political parties allowed this landfill to happen, but we won't go back to there. Over the past 10 years, it has been a Conservative Secretary of State who's been in charge of the Environment Agency. So George Eustace, as the incumbent, does have to take some responsibility for that. And so since ultimately he does have the power to do it. So yes, I'm trying to keep this apolitical, but to answer your question, that is the person that has the ultimate authority on this. Oh. The question was if take core samples and fine gypsum, should action be taken to remove it from the site? Well, the Environment Agency aren't taking core samples. Again, they have deferred the responsibility to, this Quarry Limited, overseen by MJCA, who were the guys that produced the alternative odour report. And so, yes, if they found gypsum, my sort of take on it would be that you just leave it in situ, because to excavate it would probably generate far more pollution overall. So, but they would, I think the Environment Agency, they know it's there, so it would only be confirming. Core sample for me would be about finding other materials in there that shouldn't be in there, which Stephen Graham, they've been looking into this.
Helen has one.
Oh, hello, Helen.
Yeah, can I just go back to the point about the triangle?
Oh, yes.
So obviously it needs water. Now on that, yeah, that's on the side. Yeah. On that Zoom meeting with we asked the question about why it was worse when it rains.
Yep.
And they said they've got absolutely no evidence to substantiate this. They said cold, yes, but not rain.
Right.
So do they? I mean, are they not taking this on board?
I don't know.
It would make it worse.
Yes, the question was whether rainwater makes it worse. Yes, it gives a solvent through which mixing can occur. So that'd be one of the reasons. It will also displace gas pockets within the upper layers of the landfill, which will then, if not properly captured, end up in the air. And so, and also it tends to be that with rain comes damp conditions, so hydrogen sulfide stays more across the ground rather than it pluming off into the atmosphere and dispersing more effectively. So yeah, they need to look into this more.
They said, well, half-heartedly said that they look into it. But we've had those.
No.
Well, why are they looking back to it? What's the weather condition? If they're not looking into every possibility.
They actually look into very little on the report. They will only look into the actual detail of your report if they have an officer in the area at the time who can investigate it. And I think it's ludicrous that one of the mitigations they're not considering is to have a full-time person on the site. That's going to be so inexpensive compared to all this, all these PR events that are fighting against litigation. It's just a full-time person that, including all their overheads, 150 grand a year, perhaps. Not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of this problem. I mean, on legal costs are far more than that. So it's simply when they say they're doing everything they can, I just can't understand why that hasn't been done.
general public themselves are actually giving their board.
We are, yes, we are doing the
So
job.
infuriating.
Yeah, and we're paying our taxes for the privilege. Yeah. Chris?
Just to comment on Helen's comment, in the very first kind of consultation we had with the EA, I asked a question about what happened in January, and they said we had a lot of rain. And that's what they said. They actually said that on record, on the phone, we had a lot of rain. If you remember, we had a lot of rain and that blah, 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 blah. And at the point they weren't admitting the gypsum, but they had said it. So they're playing, you know, it's what they do, isn't it? But they've said it, so it knows.
The point there was in the first EA engagement session, when queried about the about why things got significantly worse in January, the EA themselves said because we had a lot of rain. So clearly, if that's the excuse, then you know that they must have a plot. They must have a theory as to why that does make the situation worse. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Next, please. The question was, will the hydrogen sulfide production cycle go on forever? It won't go on forever because there's a finite amount of gypsum and biodegradable material within the site. And if you stop tipping, obviously you cut off the sort of the food, the nutrients to that sulfate producing bacteria. But it won't be immediate. If you stop tipping, it would be a good while down the road before you started noticing the benefits. But this is the thing: when they say it's old waste the problem, well, new waste today is 2022's old waste. They have actually defined what they mean by old and new waste now, which Stephen's been pushing them for quite a while, and that was. And they're saying anything before May 2021 is old, and beyond that is new. But yeah, they had to be pushed on that. And what they're saying that the difference is that new waste shouldn't contain any gypsum because they revised the procedures. Read into that what you will.
They're not checking the ones.
Exactly. What it is the Environment Agency used to be more the police role. You know, they would actually do the investigations themselves. Now they're more like glorified auditors. They look at the procedures, do all the procedures. Okay, yes, okay, we trust them to follow them, and that clearly doesn't work here. So that's problem. And I don't want to say too much more on that because Stephen actually covers some of that in his presentation. Right, if there are, oh, sorry, Lydia.
So we've got situation as today, so there's what areas of the site. What areas of the site. I don't hear anything from the environment agency, but we just get stopped. In fact, it's like maybe kind of condition of waste on the current kind of area they come into completion. That's why the food is happening.
Yep.
So it looks that's them, they're all not they start putting the common areas to themselves.
Yes.
I would really like to know whether what's happening with during back years and years. Are we going to get that and what's in place? That's not going to happen.
Yes.
What needs to be in place for that not happening? Same problem again. What's the difference there after the year after?
Yes. The question for the audience there was, as we move on to new cells, will we expect the same problems to repeat? To some degree, yes, because as you come up above ground, you increase the surface area to the environment. But this is where, if the Environment Agency is serious, they need to ensure that they've got continuous monitoring of this site and clearly defined thresholds where they come back to investigate, because it can't be left up to us. And we don't get relieved immediately anyway. So so yeah, they need to come up with a procedure for if it hits 0.9 parts per billion, we're on site, we're investigating and taking early action. And I believe that the situation we have this year, if there'd been intervention September last year when it was first requested for additional monitoring, would have been in a much better place by now. So that is it's very disappointing. It's also disappointing that they have chosen to appeal the High Court judgment, because I know that you have to put technical people on that as well. So technical people will be distracted dealing with that when they should be dealing with the problem. Right, I'm afraid that's my time up. So I shall hand over to Stephen Murray.
Thank you.
What do I need to do?
I won't go far. Right. Can you see the slides on Zoom?
No.
No. I've just moved. I moved back to screen. Can we see the slides on Zoom now? I actually see the
Yeah, obvious.
brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it moves the meeting controls onto the screen.
Hello, folks. Very few of you probably know me, but might recognise my face from some of the Twitter responses I make and from my Facebook page. I'm Steve Murray. I got involved with the scientific committee a few months ago, Marchish, something like that. I got involved with the Stink campaign when we had that big episode of emission. And I think that was the case with a lot of people, to be honest. There's been a lot of suffering going on in the area for a good many years. In fact, ever since it became a landfill, shortly after it became a landfill. And it was very localised. It was very localised to the Nottingham and Silverdale areas. And the vast majority of it, in all honesty, I live up in the West of Sinha. We were aware of the stench as we drove past the quarry every now and then, but we didn't realise just how much suffering was going on. And that's a shame on us. So I got involved, as I say, back in February. In something like June, July this year, I did a little presentation up in Hanley. Alan was there, giving me support, very much appreciated. And the theme of that was better communities, building better communities. And Mick asked me to do an update on that, moving forward to a better world. Now, there might be some controversial aspects about what I'm going to say, but hopefully you'll take it as it's meant to be delivered. Reality check. Mick has already said that to close the tip tomorrow would be disastrous. That is the elephant in the room, and I'm going to address it now. They cannot shut the tip tomorrow. It's not going to happen. It would be suicide. The effects on us as a community would be absolutely devastating. What we need to do is stop them filling it with crap that shouldn't be going in there. We need them to stop putting in materials that biodegrade. We need just brick and rubble, no plasterboard, just purely inert waste that will not react. We have to get the levels up. That is a fact. We've got nowhere to go on that. If we leave it as it is now, what we've effectively got is a big paddling pool to fill up with water, which will then take all the nasties in that tip, put them into the ground source water, we'll also end up with massive emissions of hydrogen sulfide. That's the reality, Jack. I'm sorry about that, but that is the reality. We have to get the tip filled. We need to fight for them to only put inert material in there. That is the way forward. We have to stop them feeding the sulfur producing bacteria. So I'll get that out of the way from the start. Yeah. But we've not got the levels. That's the problem. What we've effectively got is a big mountain, and then all the other cells are still relatively empty. We need to get them up to the same height. Otherwise, you've just got this big pool gathering area of water. It's you know.
When you say biodegradable waste,
Yeah.
what biodegradable waste is going in? Do you know?
All sorts. I mean, do we know accurately? No, is the honest answer, because we're reliant on people filling in dockets, lorry driver handing that docket over and it being accurate. I've investigated a lot of the records of the materials that have gone in there, and they're very vague. If you look at the processes and the industries from which the waste come from, it's terrifying. So my background is, I've always worked in science. I've predominantly worked in biological science and working with fancy microscopes, cancer research, all sorts of stuff. When I look at the nomenclature that they're using to describe the waste going in there and the processes, for sure arsenic, for sure chromium, for sure lots of nasty VOCs, absolutely no question about that. Right, but it's disguised. They're very careful in the way they work the dockets. Yes.
I'm sorry, they can shut it down. They can.
You would realistically,
Then there's going to be long term.
yeah. Yeah, if the line does leak, but the problem is if you start digging in there now, just the eruption of hydrogen sulfide would be. Oh yeah, I mean money comes at the money. It should, yes. I totally agree. I'm not denying that. I'm saying
a lot of money and be very.
Yeah.
That happened anyway.
I think, in all honesty, if they did that, the sudden eruption in emissions would make the February-March incident look like nothing.
Oh, that's all the waste is gone. And then there would be no.
Yeah, but are you prepared to put up with that? I mean, how it's taken from 20 now to 2000 and what? 2009? Something like that. It's taken from 2009 to get to where we are now. Yeah, well, it depends. If we can persuade them to tip nothing but inert, if we can persuade them.
I don't think that's possible.
Yeah.
Because how much for the environment? I can imagine they're getting between 15,000 to 60,000 pounds a year. Whereas we know why. Or they don't even have to pay. I'll come, honestly, we'll come on to that in a few slides' time and explain my take on it anyway. What I was going to say. Yeah.
Have you seen the compliance assessment reports in that case when you operate?
No. I mean, when Mick asked me to do this talk, he did get a bit overexcited, and he thought, hooray, alpine fresh air at last, and Adam was there to film it. But realistically, this little chap and these young ladies, that's what we're fighting. That's what we're fighting. It's got to be. It's got to be children. They've got to have a better future. They can't, grow up for the next 20 odd years surrounded by that. This is just abominable. You can't do this. And we need a better future for these children, for sure. No question about it. There's got to be a better way. That terrifies me. Those pictures absolutely terrify me. I've got no idea what that middle picture is. Not a clue. Here, who knows what's in that? Just scary. Sorry, Steve.
The lady was there,
Yeah.
compliance.
Yeah.
Take a couple of minutes to explain something.
Yeah.
You're aware that the photograph is very good.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
We got the compliance assessment report that the private agency said that they did on those photographs.
Right. Yeah.
Which was done over the phone.
Yeah.
And only one item was assessed. I've got the copies before from around the agency. They also sent me the driver's document.
Yeah.
That was delivered on that day. We took the photographs on the 25th of January 2019.
Yes.
This is directed at the family.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah.
We took those photographs on the 25th of January 2019.
Yeah.
The environment agency accepted the driver's document on the 16th of February 2018.
Yeah.
So it proves to me all we've done is pick the photo, spoken to the director of that, and said, can you just send us some documentation, please? You have to apply.
Yeah.
That's all we've done.
So exactly what you're saying. I mean, if we can go back one. Hang on, sorry. We'll get there. It's decided to play. Oh, what?
Where's me? American.
Technology is playing up, folks.
See the left and right.
It's not
Yeah.
working.
It's there. We've all gone pear-shaped. That's better.
So yeah, if we look at that, these are all old photographs. These were taken beginning of this year. Matter of perspective, really, as to whether things are getting better. Picture on the right, left, quite old. Picture on the right is quite new. To be honest, picture on the right looks like what? Bit of a mole hole. It's basically after we've rendered it with the posi shell. But that's recent. That's recent. These photographs were taken a few weeks ago. I can't see any difference in that from what we were seeing earlier in the year. As you say, IBCs. IBCs are recyclable. They're supposed to be crushed if they're finished with and dealt with. The metal around it. Why haven't they recycled more? They've just been dumped and they've got contents. Yes. So intermediate bulk containers. So if you work in places like they use them all over the place. They use them down in the cake factory. Outside you'll see all these storage vessels. They've usually got flour. They can have chemicals in. They can have fluids in, syrups in. Yep. Yeah, yeah, thank you. It says it all really, doesn't it? Yeah,
When it was put to balance, the deeds were going into the landfill. And the question why?
yeah,
They said they were happy,
yeah, well,
they are not.
no,
Everything goes to landfill or not.
Yeah.
The deeds in that, what the difference thing, because they wouldn't be putting them in if the stuff inside it wasn't more risky than the value to them for recycling.
I mean, if you look at this photo,
Sorry.
I mean, if you look at this is, you know, you'd be more concerned about the area on the bottom left, the housing estate. The thing on the right looks what? Somebody's redeveloping a parkland. It doesn't look particularly innocuous. And we live in a beautiful area. That's a wonderful photograph. That drone footage, you know, we've got lots of green land around us. We don't need this. We do not need this at all. So how do we get here? Valid question. You know, before we can move forward, we need to know how we got here. Well, that's the reality. That's how we got here. And this isn't portioning blame to anybody. Everybody in the country is responsible. When we look in our grey bins, what have we got in there? When we look in the green bins, what have we got in there? When we look at the blue bins, what do we put in there? When we go shopping, what do we buy? When we do house improvements, do we go for the cheapest skip? Or do we pay for somebody that's going to do it properly? Steve?
Why are we taking control?
Correct. Yeah, that's what I'm that's what I'm, yeah. 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 But I mean, the thing is, you know, where does our waste go? Because I can tell you now, Newcastle Borough Council only recycles 10% of plastic that goes in that blue waste bin. Where does the rest of it go? It doesn't go for incineration. What happens is, it gets packaged up and sent somewhere else to be somebody else's problem.
I spoke to someone the other day who worked at the incinerator itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where we've got, this is how we've got here, is that as a nation, the amount of rubbish that we've generated and the way that we're treating that is wrong. We're not taking full enough responsibility. And this is the other problem. Self-regulation, Mick mentioned it, okay? Every single step of the waste chain is self-regulated. Every single step, municipal, corporate waste, self-regulated. We fill in, telling you what we're receiving, how much we're receiving, and the nature of the materials we're receiving. We send that to the transit station. The transit station then says, oh, right, we've received X amount of plasterboard, we've received X amount of rubble, we've received X amount of iron, scrap metal, whatever. And they send the dockets off and you go, oh, right, okay, fine. Then the stuff that's not sorted for recycling goes to landfill. And this is the best bit, fantastic. Send it to landfill and they self-regulate. They tell the EA, yes, no, we're not definitely not having any plasterboard. We're definitely not having any fines that contain gypsum. How do you know? Well, Bob stands on the back of the wagon, looks inside and goes, yep, nothing in there. Then it goes up into the cell. They dump it into the cell and they go, yep, looks fine to me. Then they spread it out and then they go, yep, that looks fine. At no point do they do any analysis on that waste. It's all visual and based on the document. It's an easy test. It is an easy test. They can do simple chemistry, or they can use a handheld device that will identify signatures for gypsum. They don't do that. They don't do that. And the EA rely on the information supplied by Red Industries, Wallace Quarry, any other landfill around the country. They rely on them. Well,
We're frozen.
sorry about this, man.
It's just frozen. Those things are going on. The arrows when you just go. Yeah, right underneath. Yeah.
I think laptop stopped responding.
The simple answer is that self-regulation does not work. It doesn't work. Turkeys do not vote for turkeys. Reality is that for mixed waste loads, tax on that, 97.9-ish, depends on top of that, per tonne. For inert, £3 per tonne. So, if you're a company and you want to make money, you cut your costs. You know. You shove a kid in front of a chocolate cake and give it a fork and say, you mustn't touch it. What's going to happen? All the stuff on the left there, £97 a tonne, tax, plus the gate fee, whatever the gate fee, varies across the country. I found one establishment that for some reason was only charging £110 for plasterboard, but was charging more for rubble in the material. It makes no sense. The rubble, £3 a tonne, plus the gate fee. Yeah, what are you going to do if you're running a business? What are you going to pretend? Yeah. Yeah, £97 tax. So basically, if you're dumping, if you're taking a load of plasterboard into the it's hazardous waste effectively. So they will charge you tax on that per tonne, £97 plus the gate fee. So the gate fee could be, you know, another £100 per tonne. So a total, say for plasterboard, of £200 a tonne. Well, if you trammel it, make it into fine powder, and then mix it in with rubble, you go from £200 a tonne to £100 a tonne cost for you. What are you going to do? That's the reality. It's all economics. So, you know, does self-regulation work? No, it clearly doesn't at any stage during the process. Definition of insanity. Repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. How far are you going to go for your kids' future? Okay, this is down to not this room, but everybody in the UK really. Life cycle of plastics. That's scary. You know, your toothbrush that you throw in the bin, 500 years to break down. Your plastic cup, 450 years. Your plastic water bottle. I can't tell you how mad it makes me, the fact that we go into a shop and we buy bottled water. It's insane. It's insane. and it's in a bit of plastic that's going to take 450 years to break down. Now, bearing in mind that a lot of these plastics, that I do a lot of work with a particular manufacturer that produces lots of plastics, lots of films that go over your meat and your veg, etc., etc. The sophistication and complexity of the chemistry within those plastics is astounding. The downside is you can't recycle half of them. So everything you put in your plastic bin, thinking I'm doing a wonderful job here, thank you very much, I can feel good. Actually, only 10% of it, only 10%. That's the reality. An awful lot of our plastic doesn't end up in the UK. It's classified as recycled. Goes somewhere, gets bundled up, gets shipped out. We've recycled. We haven't, but when it gets to the other end, this is the reality. So my question, if we can rephrase it, is how far are we going to go for other kids' futures? As a community, we know the effects of landfill. We know the suffering it causes. We know the misery, the mental anguish it causes. Do we want to inflict that on other communities? I don't think we do. I think we have an opportunity to be one of the leading places in the country for proper recycling, for ensuring that people don't like doing it. I know you don't like doing it. I don't like particularly doing it. But putting your food waste into your food caddy and then putting it into the green bin. Okay? Don't put it in your grey bin. If you put it in your grey bin, you are feeding the sulfur reducing bacteria more hydrogen sulfide. Not necessarily for us, but for another community elsewhere. Yeah. Yeah. If you go to the incinerator, I can guarantee you that probably a third of the vehicles going through that site ain't from Stoke-on-Trent. They're from Newcastle on Lyme. Because we've got nowhere to go. We've got leases, which you can either get into if you're lucky, because they're not having to swap one of the containers around, or when you're standing in the queue for half an hour. There's no incentive in Newcastle really to carry out recycling in the way that they do in Stoke within the city. So, any questions? I know I've raised some controversial topics there, but I think the reality of it is that we do have to take some responsibility ourselves in the way that we process our rubbish. We've got to be more careful what we put in our bins because we suffer for it. No. No. Basically, the answers I got back so far from freedom of information requests have been this is the, with regard to measuring particulates, it's no, because it's difficult in terms of chemistry. In terms of the what's new waste, what's old waste, we've only literally just got that. I've been banging on about that now for I don't know how long. It's in the last few weeks that we've got that back. Yeah.
Old waste, we knew that that was new.
Yeah.
After we were having problems, so we can't say it's.
They don't test, they've got no idea. They cannot categorically assure, again, I've asked that question through the information, they cannot categorically assure me that the waste that's going in now is free of gypsum.
Yeah. I mean, the banning on that, what's its fines?
Yeah.
And they say, how do we know? We'll test it.
Yeah. It's the simple chemistry. I mean, they've got two universities on the doorstep. They've got one right literally on the doorstep.
Yeah.
It's a simple chemical test. Just that's the difference. You can do it with a handheld piece of equipment, just point it at it and it will give you a signature, a little graph showing you a signature for certain elements of. They can do that now. But they're not going to do, well, they're not going to do it because obviously, you know, £200 a tonne, 100 quid a tonne. If you're the landfill operator, there's a possibility that with a vague description on a docket, you could take mixed waste, but not show it as mixed waste. You charge the person that's dumping it a lot of money. To the EA, the tax man, it was only 3 quid worth of tax, not 97 quid worth of tax. I'm not saying that happens. I'm really not saying that happens. I'm just saying, you know, hypothetically, it could.
You asked them about his classification and everything.
Yes, sir.
You know, usually Springwood to, we've got a massive group, we've got a massive within the groups.
Yep.
There's Springwood for responsible recycling within the group.
Yes. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Working with, shops. Where we go.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, okay, that we, the general public, we're always given the ticket. Okay, we're to blame because they told us to go out and buy diesel cars because diesel cars were the way forward because they use less fuel and get more better fuel economy. Then they become the devil's spawn. Go out and buy a nice new shiny condensing gas boiler. Now they're the devil's spawn because we're using gas and we need to put in an air heat recovery pump. Same here, you know, we are the problem apparently because the manufacturers produce so much that you don't need into the supermarkets to us. Now I'm absolutely certain if there was a national day of return all the crap to the supermarket, right, we would have a big response in terms of the amount of packaging that was generated. If everybody rocked up with a trolley full of all the packaging, every supermarket in the country, first thing the supermarket would do was offload that back to the manufacturers, because that's what they always did. Then the manufacturers would then go, who earned? Yes.
A few things to come up to say, last week I helped with a small group of people stood up the land outside the landfill from the minute it opened to the minute it closed for the whole week.
Yeah.
And I did a stint every day. And over the 2 particular companies that were bringing down the greatest percentage of the waste, and they're both water-based companies.
Yeah.
And some of the waste was coming in, the drivers actually to us, but they picked it up from other landfills.
Yeah.
But they've gone back to the landfills. And 1 or 2, actually, one particular guy said, this place needs to be shut down. I'm telling you that, not on freeway to tell my company. Stobart's for waste, and then it's not contract. I phoned them, they complained, and the girl on the line said we shouldn't be there, we shouldn't be. So we noticed that kind of thing. The other thing that goes to my mind is that, you know, I go to the supermarket and I buy stuff that's coming from God knows where, and that's like packed in plastic. You know, but I can't go to a corner shop and buy vegetables that have come from down there. That's what we've got to start doing.
Yeah.
We've got to start staying away from supermarkets and supporting small people that live down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's buy from them.
Absolutely, exactly.
It's out of season. If it's out of season, it's out of season. I have to in season. You know, that's the only way we can do it is to actually cut back what we expect to consume. You know, not even on the level of the packaging, we're way off what actually it's going to take to make a change.
Yeah. So, yeah.
With the packaging,
Yeah.
you know, I know this is going off this, but with the packaging and the colour, the green for recycling, and it is sort of so as designed that we can actually see. That's red. Oh, we're not buying it out of that. That packaging cannot be recycled. Couldn't, you know, back to the manufacturers.
Absolutely, but same with food. They wanted to put a traffic light system on food.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to pick up one that's got a big red symbol on it. the manufacturer's not going to do that because you're not going to buy it. You know, if you put something on this, it's probably going to kill you at some point. It'll give you diabetes. You're not going to buy it. Same thing with the packaging.
Plastic awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need greater plastic awareness. Absolutely no question about that. And you know, I'm no particular expert in plastic. And I look at some of them and is this recyclable? Is it not? Generally, if it's crinkly, you can't recycle it. Generally, if it's off a meat container, you can't recycle it. But you know, we need better education on that, for sure. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, there's a new zero waste shop and coffee shop opening in Newcastle.
Thank you very much. So that's a new zero waste coffee shop opening in November in Mary-Louise Street in Newcastle. So I've probably gone way over time. I do apologise, Mick.
It's all right. I'm just making sure because Dr. Ian Sinha is on the call.
So I shall wind up now, folks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Where's the other screen?
Do you want to break and drive in?
That's okay. Is it frozen? Can it have?
Yeah, it could be that the recording is Israel's driving two screens, Zoom and
I think it's the recording Zoom presentation.
it's the first time this laptop's ever struggled on anything.
Can I just let some people in?
Modulator.
Yeah, okay. So share. So yours is. Yeah, you're all good. Is it working?
Thank you. Yeah, for these young boys, this is incredibly modern exciting.
So what
Light as well.
I'm just trying to meet somebody. It's stuck. Yeah, so if you it's working, yeah.
Just this share. There we go.
Is that okay now?
You have to point it almost at it.
I have to point it at here.
Point it at the blue line.
Oh, that'd be mine. Try and stay around there. Okay. I should have put that.
Morning, everyone. I'll make a start because we've got time slots. If I could ask you to leave the questions till the end, if you don't mind, so I don't lose my train of thought, else I might get myself very muddled up, if that's all right with everybody. So we've spoken about the EA, and as most of you will be aware, the Public Health England get their information about this issue from the EA. So that's quite alarming because the EA initially was saying there wasn't a problem. So I became aware of it through, I think, the Proper Newcastle group, and particularly that's just a screenshot there of a comment that I made on the group. And it was when they were going to test in the same way again, as we've just heard. So my comment was, is this saying that they're measuring the same way they've always measured? If so, they will get the same results. Don't be blinded by science. You can't measure decibels with a ruler. So that's me. And I thought, this is really frightening, because if you measure the same thing in the same way, you're going to get the same results. So either everybody's sense of smell and their experiences are just completely fabricated, or there's something wrong with the way people are testing. That's it. So that was my interest in the, you know, just basic scientific principles. Either everybody's got it wrong or they're not testing properly. So this was the initial, one of the initial statements that the Public Health England made about the situation. I won't read through all of it, but basically it was quite dismissive, saying there wasn't really any issue, there wasn't really a long-term problem. A few short-term problems, but even I can pick out of that, well, nausea and headaches and dizziness, that's harm. Whether it's long-term or not, that's harm now. It causes stress and anxiety. Well, that's mental health harm. We know that. And very, very seldom have I heard the Public Health England actually talk about the mental health effects on everybody. And also, there's no evidence from health surveillance data. Well, if you don't look for it, you won't find it. You know? So I was getting increasingly alarmed and increasingly concerned that how they thought, well, we can just fob everybody up. So we weren't having it. So Sean and I started talking over social media. We didn't know each other, just like possibly we have communicated occasionally by swapping the odd comments. Sean and I sort of gravitated towards Public Health England and their lack of concern about the situation and their approach to data collection. So I know Sean was very sort of active in getting hold of them. By the way, she would love to be here today and co-present with me, but unfortunately she's had to go away. They said there's anecdotal evidence only, and what that means is it's just hearsay. It's just people saying that they're suffering with these effects, but actually there's no scientific testing. So that's what they said. And then also, I was getting increasingly concerned about what they were feeding back to Sean, which was, well, we're just getting the information from the GPs. That's how we're getting information. Well, how are the GPs recording it? Do the GPs actually think it's an issue? What's going on? So we thought we'd have a little look. So these were a few of the scientific approaches that, well, obviously we have taken or could take or we're going to take. There's a health impact survey, which obviously I will talk about in a little while. The critique of the health surveillance data collection that the PHE do. And I had the idea where we could also collect diaries of symptoms when people have been out of the area and come back, but that's kind of quite a long-term thing, which would require quite a lot of resources. But these are just ideas that we could do that would be scientific, that we could collect data for going forward. So, and it's kind of like Steve said and Michael said, that it's up to us. We can only do these things if we have the community engagement, which we do. You know, the health impact survey has been a great success because of the community engagement. But with the support, with the data, we can do, you know, we can do all sorts. So I asked Facebook users of Stop the Stink, Cap It Off, to give me their feedback on GP visits. Now, I must say at this point, obviously it's an extremely limited sample, that is. It was only on Facebook. It didn't go wider than that. This is kind of just like a snapshot. It's like, let's just dip a toe in the water and see what's happening here. So I invited them to feed their experiences back. the symptoms that they had and the GP and what the reaction was really from the GP. And not surprisingly, it was variable. You've got some GPs that were very well aware of the area. They were very keen to attribute it to the landfill and documented it as such. But other feedback that I had was that it wasn't really, that GPs were reluctant to associate any symptomology with the landfill. And then the other issue is, how were they recording that? Because if they're actually writing it in people's notes, how was anybody actually going to find out? Or were they coding it? And they have these, the SNOMED, I think that's the way you pronounce it, codes, where you can actually look at that data and you can find it. So my conclusion on this was poor data collection leading surprisingly to no evidence. So that is to say, they won't find the evidence because they're not looking properly. As far as I know, there's no way that they can actually access this health surveillance data they're talking about. No evidence, no problem. Sean set about finding it. And it happened at a really, really fast pace. She's worked so hard on this, really hard. So she asked me with my background sort of how to shape a study. And we decided that the best way would be to correlate geographical distance. So we collected postcodes off people and also symptomology. And let's have a look. And then she just went and did it. She just went and produced a survey almost overnight, gave it back to me, little tweak here and there, and other people that I'll go on to as well, and managed to generate it, and it went out on Facebook and other social media groups. Sarah Watts is also part of our group, and she did all the data analysis and the graphical representation, and Julie Shenton as well also helped with framework and interpretation. So many of you will be aware and have taken part in the health study, but for those of you that haven't, it was undertaken to gather data from the population of Newcastle under Lyme and surrounding areas about new health complaints or worsening health conditions that they attribute to Wally's landfill. It can't attribute cause and effect because it wasn't a randomised controlled trial. It wasn't set up for that. That would take far more resources than a few volunteers have. And but it really was to have some findings to present to the PHE to say, look, this is what we think. What are you going to do about it? We wanted to have an impact on them and what they were going to do for the future plans. So we've got part of the science team having a go at the EA, and then there's some of us going after the Public Health England, and hopefully together we can actually generate some questions and, more importantly, some answers. So what we looked at, how gas release affects a number of aspects, self-reported physical and or mental health symptoms, frequency and geography of gas exposure, and if healthcare is being accessed and the impact on well-being. So an online questionnaire was produced. It was linked via social media. There was a wide range of health reports, of health issues, and there was nearly 2,000 respondents. So it's not just like a small sample. That was a good indication of what was going on. And data was collected from adults and children, with those with pre-existing conditions and those without. So again, people perhaps won't be surprised to hear that the highest self-reported symptoms were headaches, allergies, sleep deprivation or disturbance, and respiratory symptoms. And those with pre-existing respiratory conditions were more likely to report an exacerbation of their condition. The highest was the mental health impact at 73%, with people reporting new mental health problems. And few respondents had previous mental health symptoms. So this is a heat map. So this is an area here if I could just, there's Wally's Quarry there, just that blue bit there in the middle. And this is a heat map. So red is your highest concentration here. And then it goes orange, yellow, green, blue, but all these areas are affected all around here of the area. We were amazed, we're absolutely amazed at the scope of how far this permeates. Obviously, people living in this region here suffer the most. I am in sort of Clayton area, and the smell's bad, but we don't really get the sort of the symptoms that people get that are living really close by. So that's that. We measured up to over 5,000 metres, and we really should have gone further because the graph, it isn't exhausted. In fact, it's fairly steady up to about 2,000 metres here. So you've got all these people here suffering sore throat, headaches, skin condition, nausea and vomiting, nosebleeds, allergy symptoms, anxiety, low mood, depression, lack of sleep, disturbed sleep, panic attacks, and respiratory symptoms. So the range of the affected area wasn't exhausted. Okay, so of children, you've got 24 reported taking time off nursery or school. 6% of children have attended hospital. 15% of children have been prescribed new medicines. And 11% have increased the dose of medicines they were already taking. And just a couple of the impact statements I've included here. Having to have inhaler a lot more often, having to have air purifier on all the time, having no sleep due to coughing all night long, and having to smell it all day, even at home and school. And a parent, no 8-year-old should be sat crying in their room saying they can't take it anymore. And then from the adults, we've got 8% reported taking time off work. 24% have discussed symptoms with the GP. And I put a comment on from somebody in the over 65 category who said, apart from the nauseating stench from the landfill site, I've had breathing difficulties for over a year now that are worse than previous problems. I have rubbish in my throat that I never seem to be able to clear. I cough more and have interrupted sleep due to the stench coming into my bedroom, even with the windows shut. There is no way of stopping the stink downstairs as it comes through the chimney. I've also had itchy eyes on several occasions, which I'm convinced is caused by the site, as I have not changed my moisturiser, etc. This site is a nightmare. And what about mental health? It's a particular interest of mine. My background is psychology. I was a mental health nurse and I'm now a pharmacist. So I was, people were mentioning the hydrogen sulfide and rightly so, but nobody mentions mental health. And here we've got this bit here. This can be a bit hard to understand. So if you look at that as a break. These people are people with pre-existing mental health conditions. So there's only a few that feel that their condition hasn't worsened. But look, this is a group of people that never had mental health problems before. And you've got that many being affected, only this much not being affected by this. To the extent that we've had a dedicated helpline counsellor because of the fallout, because of the distress the community is feeling, they've had to put somebody in place to support people. So how was the health survey received, the Public Health England response? So many of our findings correlate with their own investigations. However, no significant increase in local prescribing of inhalers or respiratory drugs. I don't think I quite agree with that, but going back to how they collect information in the first place, I'm not particularly surprised to see that result. They will share the report once it's done, and they do wish to engage with us soon as a science group. and it's too early to say what the impact will have on change and policy. However, so it went a bit left field, but massively was used as the supporting evidence in the High Court ruling with Matthew, which we all know about. And it was included in the judge's written ruling. So it was hurriedly finished. Sean and I were in bed typing away at night time to try and get the document finished and out in preparation for the court case. I think, you know, everybody that was involved should be massively proud of this. So Environment Agency loses landmark human rights case. David and Goliath case with environment. High Court order landfill site emitting life-shortening noxious gases. And we feel vindicated. So we're really, really happy that we were able to produce a document, albeit not for these intended purposes, that did support and help, particularly in that court case, but wider for the community. And that feels great. So to the future, they've actually said they're not worried about long-term health. That's their belief at the moment. No, perhaps Professor Sinha can comment more on that. They recommend the emissions stop due to the short-term health conditions being reported. So at least now they are actually recognising short-term health matters too. Wait for the written report. And I suppose, whereas before it was like, there's no problem, they are now engaging with us. So it is baby steps, but they are positive in wanting to collaborate. And we're trying to get in on the work that's being done at Keele at the moment. Sean's asked me if I will look at that, sort of critique the science and make sure that everything that's being done and collected is done well. We'll wait and see if that happens. So recognition, Sean, little work engine there, really engaging with the people that matter. All the scientific advisory committee, Tim, Professor Sinha, the legal team, the community. Without you filling in the questionnaires, there wouldn't have been a report. And Sean wanted me to say, on behalf of her, on behalf of us all, thank you to you. And that's it, thank you. Any questions? Steve?
Yeah. How do you persuade public health England to take a holistic approach to their assessment of health? Because obviously they've got not just the background toxicity from the landfill, we've got the general pollution from cars, in there anyway, just general pollution. We've got mental health issues, and mental health issues often cause physical health issues. Are they going to assimilate all that information together to get a real global picture?
I doubt it. A bit like the EA, really. They have methodologies that they seem to be stuck in. So I think it's chipping away at, well, you know, you need to look at the way that you evaluate your science. You need to look at your testing methods. We can have those conversations with them, especially now. I mean, the great news is they are receptive to talking with us. So, and you know, I think conversations have been pleasant. So there's no reason why we can't ask these questions. But I think at the moment, they're just particularly focused on, you know, sort of focusing on GP things, really. I don't think they get into the hard science of stuff, if that answers your question.
It's the case that, you know, they are right in what they say, that there is no scientific evidence for hydrogen sulfide. But there's massive evidence to say that living next to a landfill does cause
I mean, it's one of the reasons I really keen to push the mental health aspect because that's really hard to ignore. That's really hard to say it doesn't exist, because the way that you collect information about mental health is anecdotal. It is what people say. It is how they feel. And you can actually take a scientific approach. If you take the approach they take, you would look at increasing antidepressant prescribing, sleeping tablets. There are ways that if you even wanted to take their style of health surveillance, you could do it. So, you know, and you can't dismiss that will be there. So mental health is really, really important, and that's what I shall push, because that's going to be hard to disprove.
Breakdowns in people compared to other areas. I think that's one thing, but we're not prepared to go out there and actually research and find information and do stories because they find that it is creating those problems, creating those problems for us. There's a compensation for them. But it's in there, just not.
Absolutely, and I think also it is a bit rabbit in the headlights. I think that government agencies perhaps have a standard approach to many issues, and lo and behold, they've come across a group of people that are just not going to accept that, and they don't really know what to do with that. But as I say, they are collaborating with Keel, so hopefully we will have a different approach to finding this information out. But I think, you know, it's if you don't want to find something, you're not going to go looking in the right places, are you? And I don't know if you can see, but there's a theme overlapping there with the EA. I think the problem's big, and they probably don't have the answers. Okay.
Do we know anything about the hospital? Probably that's on the team. They're talking with the hospital. The hospital suffered because of it, and they made complaints.
Yes, Sean would be the best person to answer that. She actually works at the hospital as well as, you know, having dealings with that. We have included data from the hospital, but I don't know whether Public Health England are collecting hospital data. I'd be guessing. So I don't actually know, but we can update any questions, can't we, Mick? If answers, yeah.
I mean, this is part of the purpose of this is to show our faces and know who to ask questions to, and we can anytime send a question and we'll route it to the most appropriate person to get an answer. Yeah.
Can you tell me which department of key person at field you're working with?
I don't know. So we've not been invited yet. There was some talk of the Public Health England working with Keel, and we've made an approach to ask if we can be part of that. I did ask Sean before finalising. We've not actually had word back yet on that. That is just something that we're working on at the moment. We're not just quite there yet.
It's just that all those, while this is going on, there is a bigger thing going on the horizon, which is HS2, where they're going to tunnel that mainly through a field, and I've already had to talk to people along here who have said that the gases in that coal field are particularly obnoxious variety. It will contaminate soil. The soil of subsoil will have to go somewhere. We don't know where, and that potentially is a bigger brother to what is happening and to what is coming. And I'm very, very concerned about that they are so far behind with the discussions on the HS2 side, and yet it's going to impact exactly people who are already suffering with what is coming. And it's just the other side here, so you've got here in the middle, and then the HS2 on the side, and what is coming on the side. And it's a perfect storm for ill health of every description.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is about all government agencies, when they brought in the agency system, there was deliberate confusion and muddling of the line so that no one agency has ultimate power. So this is the situation we're in now. Public Health England rely on EA to make an assessment of the health issues, and then feedback to the EA who say Public Health England says it's fine, and that's the same across every boundary. Claire Dennis has absolutely no power other than the higher authority. She's middle management. She doesn't have the authority to create those down that goes right to the top. Ministers have very little power. They can operate within the legal framework. That's it. If they're frightened that they're going to step outside that framework and enter the court, they don't do it. It's all designed to work like that, so that no one agency could say, do it.
And it has to look at that toxic soil, you're talking about, but then you're putting into really one soil.
Well, the fact is that they ain't going to ship it 400 miles up the country because HS2 is already massively on the budget. That they're going to require a local facility. They're going to try and get it as because you can't have, I mean, we're going to have hundreds of lorries shuttling that stuff around. But they ain't going to go all the way up to 400. We don't know that. I asked that question in Saks County Council. They went, you have to ask HS2.
We will have the HGVs
Right,
that travel through. We will have the HGVs traveling through, so we could have them small.
around like that. And we've asked hundreds and hundreds of questions. And it's got to a point where HS2 ran an event yesterday, and because I was asked a little awkward question, I got kicked out. They did not want any awkward questions. They just wanted to tick them off and they had run an event. So I was kicked out of the Navy Centre yesterday by one of their pet police, who was unmatched police. And it's getting very bad out there at the moment. Lorries running through mainly, no real washes. So go back to your video of these lorries with all sorts of stuff coming out of them, going onto the road. I know it's 10 months ago, but it's still relevant today. That is starting to happen now with the vehicles running around.
Yes,
It's going to increase.
it's worrying times, and it's good that we have. It's good that we have these. We have these get-togethers, these meetings, and we do get to see the wider picture and the similarities with local problems for everybody. Yes, thank you.
Next line, and the health survey still open.
Uh,
Support if we survey on the North Staffordshire Week because the next line is got.
Yes. Yes.
It's important that we raise the increase of respiratory issues
Yeah.
and mental health issues.
What we recognise the limitations of the study. It was limited to online. It's basically lack of resources. We're full-time working mums, and it was done in a rush. But we were very mindful that we weren't able to put out paper copies. We didn't have anybody to distribute. We would have loved to have done that, and maybe it is something that we can look at in the future. There's all things with GDPR, the confidentiality, leaving personal information at drop-off points. It was certainly considered, and it's definitely something that we need to do, we need to look at. So that particular survey is finished, but we can look at ways of gathering that information.
The majority of people I was speaking to yesterday were in fact not on the internet at all.
No.
That was another big concern because the advertising that was only on the internet. So a very small number of people.
Yeah,
will ever be
yeah,
able to get
yeah. So yeah, well, that's difficult.
I know did they ever come back or give an answer to whether they actually did start cascading information out to the GP? And
which is good that participating in the backwards to get the codes. I'm code driving.
Yes, yeah, well, I think we've had this the discussion, which is
Yes,
why
yeah.
I kind of drove this, but no, no, I mean, I tried to write to all GPs, but the letter bounced back. I did produce a letter, but it kind of didn't go through the right channels and it bounced back to me. So that got shut down there. I don't think we've got an answer back yet on how they code that information, but like I say, we are having these engagement conversations now, and that's quite useful actually. We can have a list of questions that we have and we put forward to them, so that's definitely going to be one of them.
Yeah, because I mean, I know Larry has shown us, and that is
Yeah, yeah.
and they said, oh, possibly they would be looking.
From what I could see, it was recorded in any way a preferred style that the GP uses. So I don't think there's been any formal. I think I did ask also the questions to ask people, have the GP been made aware by Public Health England, and nothing, no, not at that point, no. So I'm sceptical that happens at the moment.
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced.
No, yeah. And so they won't find an increase in report. They won't find an increase in inhaler prescribing or respiratory drugs, will they? If they're not looking in the right way. So yeah, we'll park that one. Are you waiting to take over?
I was just going to.
Can I take one more quick one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's more along the lines of the social body. If at the time you smell it, you get to sign.
Yes, that's absolutely what everybody needs to be doing. And we have asked that in the group again. It's only, we're only kind of like volunteers. We're not a big organisation, so it's only on Facebook. But yeah, we have said, please, 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 if you suffer any symptoms, ask them to put on your notes. You think it's to do with the landfill? Absolutely. Really important, that is. Yeah. I know. No, I know. I think there was just one more lady here that had asked a question.
I think generally speaking, you look at what our funding reporting, because every applicant reporting time and effort.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you will. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's no direct correlation.
Say that there was something open letter from the Selfregulation that was published a month ago. But I thought it was quite interesting for its analysis of, how we approach health issues and how it's just kind of almost kind of common sense kind of response to underestimate the value of just people around about saying that talk health information that is taken that the common person's words not necessarily will take
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
at face value in that sense. And it's quite interesting because when I attended the consultation event, held across parties, that issue came up at least twice in my conversations with different people. It's like you trust all of the people who live in the area.
Yeah, it's about data collection. So if you know anything about research design, you've got your Rolls Royce at the top, which is your randomized controlled trial. You'll then go down your cause and effects, and you'll perhaps have correlation studies. So even though it doesn't cause it, but it happens at the same time, you'll come further down, and then right at the bottom of the food chain is anecdotal evidence. So anecdotal evidence is things that people say, folklore, things we believe that then have to be turned into a scientific study as the scientific community understands it. So yes, people's opinions matter, but I can understand why it needs to be more robust in a way. But you're absolutely right, people, and which is why I went back to saying, well, it's hard to disprove mental health. So
in direct correlation, number of complaints, perspective on whether it's getting better or not. As soon as those complaints start to tail off, by the way, Mark, make a mental note. you go shopping. It isn't about the home, it's when you go shopping. Have a good way.
You have that weekend, school to get to better. Exactly. Getting less.
Exactly.
And I said, well, believe me, I said,
We've got less support. Yes, sure. We don't see it.
You know, not the.
Right, I'm well over time, so thank you for your attention, and I'll.
Right, are you there, Ian?
I am Mick. I am.
Right,
Can you hear me okay?
what I think we'll do is I'll hold the microphone over the speaker and
Okay. Can you hear me okay? I seem to not be able to see you guys now, but I can hear you. I can hear you clearly.
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Fabulous. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't hear a lot of the questions that were asked, so it might be easier to save them for the end, but I'm happy to do whatever. And first things first, I just want to say a huge thank you for the invitation to come along today. I'm sorry I couldn't join you. I'm on call from, I've asked someone to cover for now, so that's an hour's call, but it's a little bit of a trek, so I thought it'd be safer to be up here. It's been a really lovely morning. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed watching the talks. My 11-year-old watched your talk, Steve, and she left my office and said, rubbish and waste are really important. And as I sat down, I realized she, left some empty crisp packets and stuff on my desk. I thought, okay, so she's learned partly, but it was a lovely talk, and yours, Mick, and Dr. Parkinson. I think that the health survey that you've done is just amazing. It really is an important piece of work, and I feel like you've done what I was going to say, but better. So that was the first thing, really, was for the thanks. And the second thing I thought as I was watching the talks this morning was it's been certainly, I mean, I know you guys have lived with this for a long time, but for me, it's been a real whirlwind. I looked back to see the date, and it's almost exactly 4 months ago, which was Clean Air Day. And I think we tweeted something. So in Alder Hey, where I work as a respiratory paediatrician in Liverpool, we'd started a clean air clinic, which is lovely. It's really good. And we see children who might be having problems because of indoor or outdoor air quality. And we said, oh, this is dead good, look at this. And it was Debs Carter who tweeted something like, well, if you think that's bad, look at how we live here. And my jaw hit the floor. I saw pictures that we've seen this morning and that you see every day, and it's disgusting. And I don't think I've ever seen anything as gruesome and grotesque as what people are making you live through, and it really hit me. And since then, I feel like, even though I've not had the chance to come and see you, I just feel a really close bond with your community. I think you're a great group of people, and one day I'd love to come down and have a beer with you, and hopefully breathe this alpine fresh air that we're all after. Just a few other things in terms of thanks, really, because it's a good opportunity to just thank some people that I've been working with over the last few months. And the first thing to say with that is that I seem to get a lot of love on Twitter, and lots of you message me all the time to say thanks. Honestly, and this isn't some sort of faux modesty thing. Honestly, all this is just I wrote down on a piece of paper what we say to people in clinic. That's all. This is bread and butter to me as a respiratory paediatrician. This is my job. But actually, looking at what a lot of the real heroes in your community have done, I think you should be proud of each other and proud of yourselves. I think as a community, you pulled together and achieved something that was amazing, and continue to do so, and should continue to fight. I think the citizen science and the community science behind this has been immense. It's been, you know, absolutely top level stuff. And when you juxtapose what you're doing with what the EA are doing, you think there's a massive gulf here, and it's, you know, it's the community that are driving this. It's inspirational, really. And with the science team, and especially, I've had a lot of dealings with Mick, and with the community itself. You know, there are so many of you that I've spoken with that I'm just in awe, really. I think the GPs and the doctors around you are on your side, and it's nice to see health professionals pull together in that way. And then two final things, really. Firstly, as a paediatrician, you know, I get inspired by children and families, and I get inspired by people who stick their neck on the line and go out to fight for children and give them a voice. And on that front, Ian Wise QC and Rebecca Carrier and the legal team, you know, and the legal team have been absolutely inspirational. They've been, I mean, you know, like in all honesty, there were in the weeks leading up to the court case, I don't think they slept or ate or spent time with their family. They threw absolutely everything at the case, and again, you know, it was awe-inspiring. And the top of the tree really is Matthew and his and his family. I mean, to display that degree of bravery and courage and honesty, and really put yourself out there, for people around the world to look at you and you know, comment on your circumstances, is a level of bravery that we rarely see. And so, putting all of that together, the first thing I want to say is thank you very much for letting me be part of the story. I elected not to do slides today, if that's okay. I'm really slided out at the moment. Every couple of days I'm doing a talk somewhere, and I thought slides are good. Slides are really important, but I elected against, if that was all right. And instead, just for the next, I thought I'd leave plenty of time for discussion and questions, and instead just talk through some of what I think are the key elements of your experience at the moment with regards children. So let's move on to that. So the first thing really, I think, is that when we think about the risks of living near this ridiculous landfill site, I think there are two elements to it. One is the acute risks of the spikes in hydrogen sulfide, and you know, when the air quality is particularly bad, and the second is the chronic exposure risk. And I'm going to come back to both of these. And for me personally, I think, you know, they've both got, you know, they're both really important. But I think for me personally, the chronic stuff is the stuff that's often a bit hidden. And having seen Public Health England's messages recently that there's no long-term risk of this, yeah, I don't buy that at all. And I hope in the next 10 minutes or so to explain why I think that. And I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of acute and chronic risk. So just in terms of why I think the chronic stuff is really important. In my jobs, I'm a respiratory paediatrician. I've been a consultant for about 7 years or something, 8 years. And before that, I was training as a respiratory paediatrician. My fascination is paediatric lungs. And so even though we heard in the last talk about the importance of mental health, and I think that's just as important as anything, I'm going to say the thing that keeps me awake at night and the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is the idea that that the respiratory system of children is something that we need to get better. So when we see patients in the clinic, when we see children in my clinics or on my ward rounds, one of the things that I often end up saying to parents is around lung growth and the development potential of the respiratory system in children. And this is particularly key in my baby clinic. So I do a baby clinic every week where I see children or babies who've gone home from various hospitals on oxygen because of chronic lung disease, the same condition Matthew had. And we follow them right the way through their babyhood and their childhood. And the first thing I tell the parents is, look, you know, I'm not thinking about your child now. Your baby will be all right now. He'll be all right. He might bounce in and out of hospital a little bit, but they'll be okay. We'll get them through. What I'm really thinking about is them in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, we want them to live a happy, healthy life. That's why we're there. And so when we think about that, this is one of the key things I think that came out of the court case, was the idea of lung growth. So what happens in essence when your lungs develop? They start to develop almost as soon as you're conceived. So in the womb, your lungs start to develop very quickly, and they develop very, very rapidly. And then you're born, and you're born obviously with a functional respiratory system that should be able to cope. And then for the first couple of years of life, so up until infancy, that's the most rapid time of lung development. And what we mean by that is your lungs both getting bigger and more sophisticated. Okay, so if during the course of these talks this morning, in terms of a half an hour talk, if we think how intricate the respiratory system is, you start to see why that development is important. If we opened out your, I think I'm presuming it's largely adults in the crowd, and if we opened out your lungs that are compressed in your chest, it would cover centre court at Wimbledon. And if we took all the blood vessels that went through your lungs and put them in a line, they would stretch from Liverpool to Rome. That's how intricate what's going on inside your lungs are. And you will breathe 30 litres, that's about 5 or 6 bathfuls of air, and you'd have something like 60 litres of fluid going through your lungs. This is a massively intricate thing that just goes on in the background. And that is what's developing in childhood. So they grow and develop and mature and become more sophisticated very rapidly. By the time you hit high school, they will still grow, but not as much. And then you hit your early 20s. So I think Dr. Salt is in his early 20s. Is that right, Mick? And and from there, it's all downhill. Like everything else, nothing works better in me now than it did 20 years ago. Everything goes downhill, and your lungs are part of that. So that's the trajectory. That's the pattern of lung growth. You grow in childhood, and then you decline in adulthood. And what determines when, the risk of sounding of being crass and flippant with this, when you die because your body stops being able to keep you going. That's how most people die. Time just catches up with you. And so where you enter adulthood and how good your lungs are when you enter adulthood and how fast they decline in adulthood are the two things that determine how long your lungs will hold out for. So both of those things are really crucial for us to maintain. And when we think about childhood and clean air, what we're really talking about is investment in good lung development so that children enter adulthood with the best lungs possible. And when we think about the risks to that, and when we think about risks of anything, I spend a lot of time as a doctor thinking about risk of disease, risk of treatment, risk of doing something, risk of COVID, risk of not doing something. All of these things come back to risks. And what's clear throughout history is that children are at particular risk of environmental problems. The other thing that's kind of clear through history is that the people who've got the least amount of money are also at particular risk of problems as well. And there are other vulnerable groups that we quite often just see as a pattern, but children are at particular risk of air quality problems. One reason is that they breathe more air proportionally for their body size than adults. One reason is that their immune systems are less well equipped to deal with the problems of air pollution and hydrogen sulfide, etc. And one problem is that they that they live with the consequences of the air pollution for the rest of their lives. So those of us in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s will breathe the air pollution, and it will cause a problem to some degree, I'm sure, but the problems that the children will face will last for their lifetime. And so I go back to Steve, your slides were lovely. And one of the things that really strikes me about your community is the children, at the protests on the front line. It's powerful. It's powerful, and they're fighting for their future, and you're fighting for their future, and that's what's key here. again, in terms of that idea of lung function, sorry, referring to my scribbled notes, in terms of that idea of lung function through life, when we think of Silverdale, and one of the first things I did was I thought, I don't know my way around Staffordshire. I'll have a look at the public health profile of the area, and I was struck. I was struck because all of your health outcomes are pretty good, apart from mental health and respiratory illness. So it's unusual, and I know this because after I saw this, I looked at every one of the 8,500 council profiles in England to see whether this was unusual. I thought it was odd. Typically speaking, heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory disease all go together. The things that cause one tend to cause all. And typically speaking, you tend to get groups of cancers clustering together as well. But your outcomes, according to Public Health England, for cardiovascular disease and stroke are bang average, bang down the middle for what you would expect for a council ward. And your outcomes for respiratory disease are all bad. You have high rates of admission for COPD. You have high rates of death from respiratory illness, but no other illnesses. You've got high rates of lung cancer, but no other, not high rates of other cancers. There's something odd. And I looked at the other 9 out of 8,500 council wards. There are about 9 or 10 that have a similar pattern to you. Some of them are also on landfill sites. Some of them are, they're kind of spread a bit across the country, but it's interesting to see. And so we're not talking about children in a community with really good respiratory health. We're talking about children in a community with very poor respiratory health that should be much better than it is. So clearly there's something that needs to be considered as part of that. So that's the kind of backdrop really to why I think the chronic side of this is important. And one of the things that came up in the court case was this idea of, can hydrogen sulfide be harmful to children's lungs? And I know there are other issues and other gases and other dusts that come out of this landfill site, and most worryingly of all, we've got no idea what they are. I wouldn't trust for 1 second that those things are safe. But for the purposes of the court case, it was very much around hydrogen sulfide, this gas that smells like a sewer. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of key things really that came up in those discussions. The first was, can hydrogen sulfide be damaging to lungs? And I think the answer is yes. So there isn't a huge amount of evidence in terms of research papers around this. There isn't a huge amount about this, but there are a handful of papers that all point in the same direction, saying hydrogen sulfide is harmful to respiratory health in children, and the results in adults are a little bit less consistent, but the results in children, I've not seen a single paper out of the nearly 10, 12 papers that have looked at hydrogen sulfide in children, some of them from landfill sites, some of them from traffic and other things, but I've not seen a single result that says, no, this is cool, this is safe. So when Public Health England say there's no long-term risk, I don't know what they're basing that on. If it's something I've not seen, fine. If it's speculation, I think it's completely wrong to speculate in that way. And the reason I think it's wrong to speculate in that way is that when we think about COPD, which is, again, coming back to this idea of chronic risk, when we think about COPD, our understanding of what COPD is has been turned on its head in the last few years. And this is why. So we all think of COPD, I'm sure you will know people who've had COPD, or at least know of it. It's basically bronchitis, emphysema, the thing that we associate with frail elderly people. It's the archetypal adult disease. This is what the adult respiratory guys at Stoke, who are very good, I know some of them, this is what they're treating on their wards at the moment, is viral exacerbations of COPD. Archetypal adult disease, and what we as pediatricians have known for decades, and what has recently been published, is the long-term follow-up studies of of people who were born in the 1950s and 60s. And what this shows is that we were all taught at medical school we were all taught that COPD, going back to that trajectory of lung growth and lung decline, we were taught that COPD is a disease where people start smoking and being unhealthy and their lungs decline really quickly. What we now know is that 60 to 70% of people with COPD enter adulthood with reduced lung function. And that's the key. That was the whole key for Matthew's case, is that children who enter adulthood with poor lung function, in essence, are on track to get COPD. And the reason that children get COPD is all traceable back to the early years, even pregnancy. By the time you're hitting junior school, your lungs are already programmed to be what they're going to be. By the time, I mean, some people go, and I do believe this, some people go even further back and say that how your lungs are when you're born will determine when you die. And there's a lot in that. That's a reasonable thing to say. But the point is, there's a window of opportunity for children in Silverdale and surrounding areas to grow really good lungs, and we're stopping that from happening, I think. And the reason biologically, which again we came back to a lot in the High Court case, was about inflammation. Okay, and what we mean by inflammation is a pattern whereby your body uses its immune system to try, sorry if you can hear my kids shouting in the background, sorry. But so what we mean by inflammation is when your body's, hang on, give me 2 seconds. Guys, where your body uses it. My grandparents, their grandparents are supposed to be watching them right now, and their level of discipline with me was up here when I was that age. They just let these guys do anything. So anyway, thank you. So inflammation, what we mean by inflammation is your body's immune system reacting to something in the body and leaving behind a remnant that can then damage the underlying airway. And we see inflammation causing problems in children as young as 2-3 years old in terms of their airways and lungs starting to change. Okay, so what we're talking about is airways that are not growing normally and inflammation being the problem. And in my mind, hydrogen sulfide, there is no reason to think that hydrogen sulfide at chronic exposure levels would not cause inflammation. Why would it not cause inflammation? It absolutely should, and I think it does. And when we think back through conversations like this that we've had through the years in pediatrics, one of the things that keeps coming up is this idea of low doses of exposure to things, and people, you know, particularly sort of rich people who stand to gain from this will quite often say, no, there's you know, the doses are so low, the exposure is so low, the numbers are so low that how can it possibly cause a problem? Actually, history is littered with things that at low doses over a long period of time cause significant harm. Millions of people have suffered and died because of poor messaging about things like, there was a time when we used to tell people go out and get as much sun as you possibly can, and then lots of people died of skin cancer. There was a time when we told people that low doses of lead in your house were acceptable, but then we found that children were at risk of getting basically abnormal brain development that would live with them for the rest of their life. So low dose chronic exposure is a harmful thing to children. And when we think about hydrogen sulfide, I mean, I'm flabbergasted. It's absolutely beggars belief to me that a gas that is in a sewer is felt to be safe for children. And this came up a lot in the court case as well, because a lot of the, I mean, you know, you can't get children and gas them with hydrogen sulfide and see what happens. You have to rely on animal studies to get a bit of an understanding. And most of the studies have been conducted in rats. And we had to say to the High Court judge, we were like, yeah, but children aren't rats. Rats are designed to live in sewers. Children, you know, human babies are not designed to live in a sewer and breathe this gas. It beggars belief to me that people are not saying that this is harmful, and in fact are saying the opposite, that this is not harmful. There is literally no evidence to say that chronic low dose exposure to hydrogen sulfide is is safe for children. There is some evidence that is inherently flawed, and going back to the last talk about the hierarchies of evidence, that, you know, observational evidence is just inherently flawed. That is what it is. But there are two key things. One is that all the results are pointing in the same direction, and the second is that it's just common sense. You know, there's a reason why we've evolved not to migrate towards places that smell like a landfill site or a sewer. You know, there are reasons why we don't go there, and that's because we've evolved to avoid sense. So the idea of low doses being safe is, to me, nonsense and dangerous, and we should fight against that. Just briefly before I finish, because I feel like I've rabbited on for a while. So I just wanted to mention briefly about the urgency to do something just before I sum up. And the urgency is this: I don't think, and I don't think any of you think this, like, it was interesting reading back through the environmental agency reports saying, well, you know, the level for safety is 150 this, and actually your levels are there. And I don't think you guys are walking around saying, oh, we think we're literally going to drop dead because the smell is so bad. What you're saying is that this is causing us to have acute health problems mentally and physically, and it's impairing our quality of life. And they're very much focused on the occupational issues here. So basically, if you worked in a sewage farm and fell in the sewage, you would die very quickly because of the massively high, sky high levels of hydrogen sulfide that you know, luckily you have touched once or twice, I think, in while he's looking at the data, but you know, those levels are sky high. And if those levels were up there, then absolutely there'd be an urgency, because people would be, you know, falling unconscious in the middle of the road just from this. I think the urgency for children here, and this is where I get frustrated about policies and laws. And, you know, I think it was great that the High Court judge, who I think I wound him up for the time that I was there, but, you know, either way, I think it was great that he put a time pressure on this. But what's really important when you look at the urgency to do things is that for children, that time pressure is massive. So, you know, we as adults often think of a year here or a year there as being, you know, something achievable, something doable. For an 8-year-old, that's an eighth of their life. You know, and it's not just an eighth of their life, it's disproportionately dangerous for them, because it's an eighth of their life at the time when their lungs are growing quickly. You know, I think there is a real urgency to do this, and to push for it well. And it's about that relative importance of that time. So to sum all of that up, I think the arguments that I would make moving forward, and I think, Steve, you said, you know, how far are we prepared to fight for their children? You guys are, you know the answer, and you're doing it. And I think if I was to throw a health and respiratory pediatric perspective behind your fight, the first thing would be, I would say, inequalities begin in childhood. So that if in 50 years we're looking at a Public Health England profile of Silverdale that still shows early deaths from respiratory disease, high rates of admission for COPD, then we've failed, or someone has failed your children. The second thing I would really push is the idea of chronic low dose exposure. Don't be fobbed off with people saying, well, the levels are 150 and it never reaches that. Don't be fobbed off by that. The issue here is chronic low dose exposure to a gas that belongs in a sewer. And the third thing is that when we think about one of the amazing things about the High Court case that's really struck a chord with paediatricians is that Ian Wise QC and his team and Rebecca Carrier had taken that to the High Court as a right to life case. When we think about right to life, what we think about, or what the legal world often thinks about, is, you know, someone's going to shoot someone if they go here, there, or, you know, or their life is acutely at risk. And what we took away from that court case, and what we're now ploughing into paediatrics in other areas, including things like universal credit, including things like the human rights to food and food poverty, is to say that things that are harmful to children now may not manifest now. They will manifest long after the people in Public Health England and the Environment Agency have retired. They will manifest in early and mid-adulthood. And that's where we'll see the problems, and that's where the right to life becomes important here. And just to finish again, to relay what Steve said, you're doing this for your children, and this is absolutely the archetypal example of the human rights of people and the human rights of children not being worth the paper they're written on in the UK. And I'll finish with that. Thank you very much, and thanks again for the chance to be part of your story and to join you today. And I'm happy to hang around for any questions, but I think someone might need to speak them down to the microphone.
Thank you. What I propose to do, because we haven't got the tech set up for coming into the audience, you just ask me the questions, and then if Ian can't hear them, I'll relay them, and we'll go from there. Have we got any questions? Oh, Stephen.
Sorry. So obviously, human body at the cellular level requires hydrogen sulfide. What effects does the excess that we're talking to the bloodstream from the vision required? Does that have cellular level?
Right, Ian. At a cellular level, we do actually produce and use hydrogen.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But what are the effects when we've got too much hydrogen sulfide?
Yeah, a great question, really good question. And so as our understanding of the human body has developed over time, we are starting to learn more and more about how cells work. And in our cells, all the time, we're producing hydrogen sulfide, exactly as you say. And what that hydrogen sulfide does, we're still starting to learn, but it's clearly complex. So in some situations, bringing it back to inflammation, in some situations, that hydrogen sulfide acts as a pro-inflammatory chemical. In other words, it brings inflammation to parts of your body where, for example, you might have an infection. In other situations, that hydrogen sulfide acts to dampen down the inflammation. And at this stage in time, we probably couldn't draw a diagram showing exactly what hydrogen sulfide does at different times. I mean, we do produce hydrogen sulfide at levels that are immeasurable to the extent that we're seeing at Wally's, and I think that's important to know. But what I think is what we can take away from that, given how intricate the role of hydrogen sulfide is that it will function within the body in something called a feedback loop. So there will be chemicals that we probably, and cells and receptors and molecules that we probably won't identify even in my lifetime, but there will be a way that your body knows that if the levels of hydrogen sulfide that you're producing are too high, that it needs to tone it down. And that's done through genes and your DNA. And there'll be times when it notices that the levels of hydrogen sulfide are low, and it will create its own hydrogen sulfide, and it will go in this little feedback loop. And everything in the body works on a feedback loop. Thyroxine, insulin, insulin is a great example. You put sugar in your body, your insulin goes up to bring the levels of sugar down and put it in the cells. If you have too much insulin, your sugar goes too low, you become hypoglycemic. That's very dangerous. And my worry about hydrogen sulfide from outside the body is that anything that you put in your body from outside will just mess with that feedback loop. So we're already starting to see that in studies of people with asthma and COPD, they have abnormally high and abnormally low levels of hydrogen sulfide. So clearly something can go wrong with the hydrogen sulfide levels within the body. And the body is masterful at managing minute levels of chemicals in a really precise way, and breathing in hydrogen sulfide from this gas from the landfill site will absolutely mess that feedback system up. I can think of no other situation where taking something from the outside doesn't mess that up. Sugar's a great example. People always say, well, you breathe it in and your body will sort it out. And, you need hydrogen sulfide in your body for, these other things. But the best analogy there is sugar. We all need sugar to survive. But if you have too much, it's really harmful. If you have too little, it's really harmful. So hydrogen sulfide, I think thinking about too much coming in your body will mess with that. So that's where I sit on where this ends up with your body's own endogenous hydrogen sulfide production.
Thank you, Ian. Any more questions? You've answered them all, yeah. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I know that you've got another talk now. Unfortunately, I may need to leave you to it, but it's been lovely to see you all. Thanks again for the invite, and hopefully see you in person.
Like, have a hand up.
Oh,
was it clap? Sorry.
oh,
Yeah.
Mr. Murray, you mentioned something along these lines, but the hydrogen sulfide in coal fuels is particularly toxic. And I'm just wondering what does,
It's all right, Ian. It's about the coal fields here.
thank you very much for the clarification.
For those on Zoom, there was a question about whether there's different types of hydrogen sulfide, but it's all much of a muchness. Is that correct? Yeah. One more question for the audience. Sorry. Ian.
I've got 3 grandchildren who live half a mile from the quarry. Apart from taking them out of the area, is there anything else I can do to help them?
yeah, I heard that. So your question was, apart from taking your grandchildren out of the area, is there anything you can do? Great question, and actually, it's a really good point that you raise. One of the things that was interesting in Matthew's case, and is absolutely what we see in our lung function, in our clean air clinic, and what we've seen in other landfill areas around the UK, just from following things on Twitter. There's a lovely picture of one of your little boys in your community, like running down the beach, and it says, "Oh, we're dreading coming home." And A, that's really sad, like people shouldn't have to dread that, but B, this idea that taking someone, this whole sort of temporal link of taking someone out of a toxic, harmful environment, and they suddenly start showing you the life that they deserve to live, is really important in children. So it's a really good point. In terms of the short answer, no, and I would even go so far as to say that one of the arguments that we should be really pushing to the Environment Agency and Public Health England is that you are and your grandchildren in this situation are completely trapped, in the sense that, they've told you to get air purifiers. There's no evidence that air purifiers do anything for anybody. I think there may be some reduction in the odor, I guess, but in terms of actually making the air quality better, they don't work. In terms of strategies to reduce the exposure to hydrogen sulfide, no, I don't know. Giving them a break is really important, and I know that that's easier said than done, and it's one of the things that we've seen through history, is that people that can take themselves out of a toxic environment, whether that be like during the Black Plague, the public health advice was, go to your rural residences, and all the slum people in these cities were going, what are you talking about? We've never even seen the countryside. So if you can get people out, then and give them a break from it to help things recover, then I think that would be good. In terms of the only mitigating factor, I would bring it back again to this idea of healthy lung growth, and the mitigating factors that can sometimes help reduce the impact of inflammation is really good diet. So particularly fruit and veg. I don't know if your grandchildren are anything like mine, but that again might be easier said than done. But fruit and veg are a really important part of reducing the risks of inflammation, and they're also a really good. The corollary of that is that fatty foods and foods high in carbohydrates can cause inflammation. So thinking about optimizing a child's diet can be really important. And outside of that, the reason that you're trapped is that, or that those kids are trapped, and this is what breaks my heart in thinking about the children in your area. There's a very poignant picture of a playground, and I've never seen a picture of a child in that playground ever, not once. And I think that what we know is that the more you exercise as a child, the better it is for your heart and lungs. and the fact that your kids can't go out and play is devastating, really. You know, that's huge. And somewhat, I think Deb's mentioned to me that, or someone mentioned that, you know, your dinner ladies at the school kind of come out and sniff the air to see whether it's safe for kids to go out. This is just insane. And you know, that would be a really important thing to mitigate any bad effects of the hydrogen sulfide, would be exercise. But I get it. I get that that's difficult for you to do when you haven't got, you might have green space, but you know, I mean, even like the seagulls, like my kid, you know, lots of children are quite scared of seagulls. And, you know, if they go around your estates and houses the way they look like they go around the landfill, and my kids wouldn't go out if there was a load of seagulls there, because, you know, they can be quite aggressive. All of these things are building up, all the little things that, you know, at first sight someone might dismiss. But all of these things, when you put them on a schematic diagram, just point towards lower opportunities for children and impaired quality of life. And that's why it's a total issue of human rights. So I'm sorry, I've got nothing clever to say about how can you reduce the hydrogen sulfide coming into the house and you know, collecting around their beds. That might be one thing. I've never thought of this before, but if they're old enough to have, we know that hydrogen sulfide settles lower down. This is one of the other reasons why children are particularly at risk of it, is that if you can smell it in their room at night time, it'll be, you know, sort of accumulating around their bed. So yeah, no, I was going to say you could put them in a higher bed, but then I just foresaw myself in the High Court when all your kids fall out of bed and break their arms. Why did you put them high? So yeah, I'm sorry, I've got nothing clever except to say that maximising, if you can, other aspects of healthy living will promote excellent lung growth, even if this might get in the way. And the key thing, really, again, to come back to, is that this will be an issue for all children, but in essence, there are certain groups of children who are particularly vulnerable, and if your grandchildren are otherwise fit and healthy, I wouldn't necessarily lose sort of sleep over the fact that they're going to be horrendously unwell for the rest of their life. But, you know, it's still something worth fighting for. This will affect some, but not all children. We should assume that it should affect all children.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right.
Much better than just other houses. So it would be really helpful and useful to know what it is about specific housing bill that will allow the gases to come in.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the case, I think, that the more modern houses like on the garden deal, that they are construction that's kind of keeps gas out. You know, that's not true. I live in Sicily, and you know, very kind of like respectable Sunday patch. I've always that houses being built with poor materials. We shop the windows. So I think that's they all do some research on pricing, you know, how it is, and I think this is probably one of my more arguments.
Basically, certain rates designed to design the house. In the case of older houses, the property and coal fire, everybody has coal fire downstairs and coal fire.
there's a lot there to promote. So they put bigger airport to all properties, newer properties, so actually it is possible to be faster compared to new property. In a new property, we get to the valuable airflow and low airflow. It drops. If you think about taking increasing sources, spinning it round in a glass of water, and then letting it sat. And just move to it, like the air flowing around on the outside. It's that. You end up with high concentration of salt.
Those on Zoom, they're just discussing how hydrogen sulfide accumulates between old and new houses. We'll get Tim on short.
You can get
That's forwards.
so that's I just go forwards,
Forwards is the bottom one.
forwards. Oh, so where? Oh, yeah, they come up there. Oh, and backwards being.
Being the centre, not the middle one.
Oh my God. I think you might have to steer. I think what you might have done.
Oh,
Yeah, you might. Yeah, is that all right?
yes, absolutely fine.
Stand round about there.
Oh yeah, yeah. Hi there, guys. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
That's good. Right. Okay. So my name's Tim Webb. I don't normally appear, so I'm a little bit nervous because I normally keep my head down. A lot of what I do, I'm involved in. So I suppose the question is, who am I? Why have I travelled up from London? Very good.
Why does it sound fun?
Yeah, yeah. I'll talk about my involvement with the Silvale community. What do we mean by particulate matter? What do we measure and why and how do we measure it? Talk about the particles themselves. I'll talk about primary and secondary emissions. I'll give you my summary of the situation and my summary, and you've got time to ask questions and answers. And I've deliberately kept it in a non-technical way because I don't want to bamboozle people with too much information. You've sat through an awful lot to say, thanks for inviting me and thanks for coming along because I've been to, because hopefully you'll learn something from it. And do ask questions at the end, please. Okay, so the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Right. So I'm a non-professional scientist, a citizen scientist, entirely self-taught. And what I do is I focus on collecting and analysing any data related to air quality, but I major on particulate matter. And the reason I can't remember, I didn't wake up one day and thought, what should I do today? It sort of evolved when I took retirement from BT and decided, what am I going to do with my life? And I sort of drifted into particulate matter. So what I do is I track and analyse incidents. I don't call them pollution incidents because strictly they're not pollution incidents. I'll come on to that. And what I do is I manage or monitor clusters of networks. So what I've done, I've got a lot of help from Mark Warren and get Claire at the back as well there. And what I do is I was concerned when I saw what's happening in Silverdale, built some monitors, I built them, designed them and built them. And we've got 10 installed around the area, which gives us live, real information. So I'm sitting there now, seeing the information, what the air quality is like. As far as the particular matter goes, I cannot tell you what the hydrogen sulfide levels are. And the other thing I do is why I keep my head down. I offer support and advice to communities. I've got about 3 groups on the go at the moment, and I've had to tone down a lot of my work because I saw your need as being more important than some of the other communities that I currently support. So I don't advertise because if I did, I couldn't cope with it. With the next slide, please. All right. Am I doing all right, by the way? Yeah, good. Yeah. Never invite me to talk about particulate matter. I'll just go on and on. Right. What do we measure by? Right. Well, basically, we want to measure gases and particles suspended in the air. So each day, each of us is breathing in billions of particles. Billions of particles. Now, we talk about gases. Now, normally when the authorities measure the gases, they normally look at the big 3, which are sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, ozone. That's one of my favourites. Not that you have a favourite pollutant, if that makes sense. I'm not being sarky, but I'm always fascinated with ozone. And then they measure these and normally they use official monitoring stations set in town centres or urban areas. And they also measure particles in the air as well, because gases are very small molecules, basically. I look at particles, and these come from a wide range of sources: tyre wear, bonfires. You've got bonfires coming up. That'll be interesting soon, I tell you. You've got construction sites, landfill sites. Oh, wood burning stoves. Don't get me started on wood burning stoves, whatever you do. Oh my God.
wood burning stoves, they've suddenly come from nowhere as a major problem. And why do we measure particulate matter? Why do we measure the gases in the air? Because we want to determine if the levels of gases or particles in the air exceed safe levels or thresholds. There's a big debate over what is a safe level, and I'll come on to that. You can ask me a question about what is safe, the interpretation. So that's basically what do we measure and why. Go to the next slide, please. So what is in the air? Well, you've got a lot of gases. They're mainly, the gases, most of what we're breathing is oxygen and nitrogen, but 99% of the gases we're breathing are that. We've also got other trace gases, and they're in much lower concentrations, and they're measured in either parts per million or parts per billion. So you've probably heard this thrown about, so I'm going to explain what that is. So if you imagine you've got a billion particles, molecules in the air, gas molecules in the air, not more than 5 of them should be hydrogen sulfide. So it's very, very small, very small concentrations of gases, but their effect is out of all proportion when the concentrations go up. Now, my particular interest is particulate matter. Basically, what is particulate matter? Right, in a nutshell, anything suspended in the air which is not in a gaseous state. So that includes solid particles and liquid droplets. Okay, that's what it is. It's anything that's not a gas molecule. And these little, and then they are solid particles and liquid droplets. As they are suspended in the air, they've got to be fairly small, logically, because first of all, they're going to be carried up from the ground into the air, suspended in the air, and they're classified in a completely different way to gases. Okay, what they're classified are they're classified according to their size or diameter, and they're measured because we measure the diameters. We'll come on to that. At the individual particles. They're also classified according to whether they're primary or secondary particles. Again, I'll go into that. And they've all got very diverse chemical compositions. These particles are not just inert dust particles. If they were, that would be good news. Unfortunately, I can only bring you not good news on that front, but that's what they are. So that's a little breakdown of what they are. Very simple. Next one, please. It's not a single pollutant, so it's not a pollutant as such. It took me ages to get my head around this. The particles vary in shape, they vary in size, and they vary according to chemical composition. They're not just inert dust particles, and they're defined by their diameters for air quality regulatory purposes. And it all comes down to the size of the particles. They've all got the possibility of being inhaled. And the larger particles are less likely to be inhaled or to be bloodier. When you breathe them in, they're more likely to get in your throat or in your nose, but not deeper into your body. So go to the next slide, please. Right, so give you some ideas of sizes. We've got a human hair, which because they're so small, they're measured in microns, which is a millionth of a meter. So is that right? Yeah, I'm an expert here. Yeah. So human hair typically is 50 to 70 microns in diameter, very small. Now the small particles, the PM 2.5, they are typically 2.5 microns. PM is particulate matter, 2.5 is 2.5 microns, very, very small particles. The ones that I study in particular, my favorites, are the PM10, particulate matter, and they are 10 microns and below. So they're much smaller than the diameter of a human hair. You normally don't breathe them, you can't see them, and you cannot smell them. But I can assure you they are here because I've been measuring them. So I can tell you they are in the room. Okay, they are there. You wouldn't know they were around. Can we have the next? And the particles are graded into 3 sizes. The coarse particles, that's the ones that are 10 microns and below. You've got the fine particles, which are 2.5 microns. And a new category they've discovered, or very little research is done into these. These are the ultrafine particles, which are the minute ones under 0.1 microns. Now, what the Environment Agency MMFs, the trailers, if we live with them, they measure particles from 18 microns down to 0.1 microns because the inlet they use cannot distinguish, it only has a filter head that can filter out particles 18 microns and below. So it could be argued that when you see the peaks, if any of you've seen the reports in the, and they talk about the TSPs, the total suspended particles, they're basically talking about the particles which are 10 to 18 microns. So they can be discounted, and the reason generally is because it's very unlikely you're going to inhale. Okay, so far, next. So what is particulate matter? Oh, I knew I should never started on this. Right, okay. It's PM10, with one that I study, is the easiest to understand and is the most widely reported. Then there is primary particles, and they are emitted directly from a source. So typically, you would know this from some of the photographs earlier on, when you see the dust being caught up by the site. So it's inert dust particles, you've got pollen, you've got road dust, etc., and they're known as coarse particles. There's good news and not so good news. The good news is that once these particles are suspended in the air, they don't travel that far. From the data that we've looked at, probably something like 400, 500 meters in old money, 400 yards, let's say, from the site. They don't stay suspended in the air that long, typically a few hours or maybe a few minutes, and they soon fall back to Earth. So that's the larger ones. That's a particulate matter of PM10. Now, the ones that give me a headache are the PM2.5. They're slightly more complex. They're secondary particles. Okay, now, what does this mean? When you get gases, and you can see where this is going, can't you? And they mix and interact with one another, these form secondary particles. These are the PM2.5, the smaller ones. The problem with these particles is once they're suspended in the air, they can remain airborne for hours or days, and they can typically be carried 3, 5 for miles. I've tracked them from pollution events, and I've tracked them traveling 10, 20 miles. And where I live in the southeast, we get a particular problem with these particles in the springtime, because the French, God bless them, put all the ammonia, nitrates, and the fertilizer on their fields. It reacts, and then a lot of particles come across the channel. So it's a big problem in the southeast in the springtime. And the distance they travel varies according to wind speed, the concentration of the gases in the air, because more gases equals potentially more particles. And this is the one I think that worries people. And probably you can work out now, when I'm talking about this, why perhaps certain agencies would be very loath to give you a breakdown of these particular particles. Because it's not just that they're particles. Imagine they're a golf ball. It's not just the particles themselves, but the belief is, and I've been discussing this with Claire and with Mark as well, they could have bonding onto them all kinds of bacteria or possibly harmful toxins, and these particles are being inhaled. So they're not just inert, but they are very small particles. The next slide, please. Now, to try and get your head around a bit more about these secondary emissions, the best thing to imagine is if you think about car exhaust emissions, you've got the gases come out. So the gases are basically unburnt fuel. It's very, very hot, nitrous oxide. When that reacts with the oxygen, which is cool in the air, oxygen is O2, the nitrous oxides become nitrogen dioxide. And what you've got, I suspect, is problems with that. This is mainly from traffic, road traffic emissions. You've also got exhaust pipe as well, dust and soot. And when some of the gases react in the air, they also produce particulate matter, secondary emissions, mainly PM2.5. Because I have studied, I've gone through different phases of my studies where I spent a lot of time studying vehicle exhaust emissions and non-exhaust emissions from vehicles as well. Thank you. Next slide. Now, the measurements. Now, as you're all aware, gases are either measured in parts per million or parts per billion. Unless you're the EA, you don't want to report them at all, really. Why? I drive it. I mean, if I was living here, it'd drive me up the bleeding wall. Why? All you've got to do is tell us what the concentration is in the air. It's not that bleeding. As you say in London, from the tin Web's called the bleeding obvious, it ain't that difficult. But it is, because it's politically very sensitive. But with particulate matter, it's expressed by the mass of the particles suspended in the air. You think, Tim, I've lost you at this point. Please, Tim, get down to earth. Okay. Well, the idea, it goes back historically, when the particles used to be collected on filters and weighed. What they would do is they would put a filter in a tube, draw some air from the tube. They would then weigh the filter before the particles were exposed on it, and they would weigh the filter afterwards. Very good scales they've got here. And what they would do is the technology did not exist at that time to either count or measure the particles. Now, historically, we've moved on, but the problem is that we are where we are with the measurements, so they still express the measurements as the micrograms or millionths of a gram suspended in a cubic meter of air. To give you a perspective, I use the paperclip and the washing machine analogy. So imagine you've got a paperclip which weighs a gram. If you cut it into 1 million pieces, each of them would weigh a millionth of a gram. You've got an area size of a washing machine, typically a cubic meter. So what we're looking at doing is expressing the weights of these particles suspended in a cubic meter of air. That's why it's entirely different. And when the EA or the authorities are reporting gases, you should be reporting gases as parts per billion, not muddying the waters with micrograms. Particulate matter is measured in micrograms, although we don't measure it in weight. Come on. So, and what they do is, because they don't tend to use an EA with their mobile modern facilities, they don't actually weigh. They don't actually weigh the particles. So how do they measure them? The idea being, they've got lasers that count and measure the particles. They then use an algorithm or a special formula to convert those number of particles into a weight. So it's all done that way. Okay, next slide. Making sense so far? Now we come on to the bit which the health implications. Now, the reason we've got these breakdown of particles, and I'll refer to my notes, because otherwise I sometimes go a bit off track, it's because due to the fact of the particles, due to the nature of the particles, it says here, because these are broken down into PM 2.5 and PM 10. Now, PM 2.5, remember, is the smaller one. So that's about 3% of the diameter of a human hair. The PM 10 are the larger particles, and the particles larger than PM 10 microns are the ones less likely to be inhaled, to get coughed up or filtered out. So when you start getting down to these particles about PM 10, you start experiencing problems, because these are more likely to be inhaled, deposit on the upper airways. The smaller the particles, as a general rule, the further and deeper they can be inhaled into our bodies. So that's why I look at the, so the reason they look at this is to say PM10 are, if you like, the optimum measurement of the particles that start to be inhaled into the airways. The PM 2.5 will get further into your lungs, and the ultra-fine particles, and here's the bad news, which they don't want you to know, is that these will get into your lungs and into your bloodstream. It's not good news, guys. And I suspect the reason you're not being told the full story is because the authorities suspect this is a problem and they don't want to admit it. If you look in the reports, you'll see information on the hydrogen sulfide. They'll mention sulfur dioxide, but if you notice, conspicuous by its absence are any narrative, any comments related to particular matter.
Oh, can I just add something? The relevant standards for particulate matter are on a per 24-hour basis, but what we get in the report is a 15-minute interval, so it's not immediately obvious to be able to, for the layman, to compare that to the relevant air quality guidelines.
No, I mean, I've purposely stayed off the thresholds for safe levels at the moment, but on the question time, do ask me that, okay? Next slide, please. Sorry, yeah. What we've got is, I think I've covered, otherwise I'll bamboozle myself and bamboozle you guys, but what we've got is two sets of measures. The WHO, the World Health Organization, have got a threshold of 10 micrograms. The EU and the UK say, oh, we can't possibly meet that. No, 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 no. It's got to be 25. And the reason you've got different concentrations or thresholds is because the PM10 are heavier particles, so they weigh more. And secondly, they're deemed to be less harmful. That's why you've got it. That's why the thresholds for the PM 2.5 measurements are lower than the thresholds for the PM10. And in every case, the World Health Organization come up with a recommendation, and the EU and the UK then come up with an objective which is invariably higher than the World Health Organization. And the statement I would say at this point, I've written this down here, there appears to be no consistently observable evidence of a safe lower threshold below which there are no effects. So when you say what is a safe, when people ask me what is a safe threshold, the answer is it depends upon the individual, whether you've got underlying health conditions. It depends upon not so much the concentration of particles, I think, but what these particles actually are. That's the other thing as well, because you might be breathing in relatively low limits of particles, but the particles in this part of the world would be completely different, I suspect, than the particles where I live in South East London. So it's not just the concentrations or the levels, but what these particles fundamentally are. Okay, next one. And just to look at the threshold, so everything's spent in the air that's not gas. Oh yeah, so big part. Oh yeah. So the EU come up with their thresholds, and 25 micrograms. The larger particles thresholds are higher. What we've got is a bit confusing. They've got the PM 2.5 only has an annual mean, whereas the PM10 has got an annual mean and it's got a 24-hour mean as well. Now, what I've spoken to Mick about, and we had concerns about this, was that the PM10 24-hour mean is being exceeded, but the EA won't admit that. That's what I think the issue is.
It's because they're allowed to do that up to 35 times a year. It does look like one course to be below that, but it's sort of, if you think it's an omission that they haven't, they don't publish how many times it's had to. That's something we've had to get the spreadsheets and do that analysis ourselves.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, here we are. Right, okay, this is an image all too familiar, unfortunately. This is taken from a construction site, but it applies to landfill site. Because when I started on my journey of understanding particulate matter, I purposely put my sensors in harm's way, and I put them near a construction site which has got contaminated soil. Oh, not good. And so this is the people all familiar. So you've got the dust that you can see in here. On the next slide, yep, a minute. And what I do is I record dust peaks. Now, there is a methodology I've developed whereby by looking at the graph, this is the peaks of the concentrations, okay? So don't worry about that. That's quite normal. Okay? Well, I'm looking for anything unusual, a peak or a spike. If it's starting at 11 o'clock, finished at 4:41, and what I'm able to confirm with people in the area, this coincides with activity taking place on site. And these are sudden concentrations because dust peaks have a particular signature. They tend to be relatively short-lived events. You get a sudden intense burst of particles released into the air, and most of you would not be even aware that this took place. That's the problem, because we're not talking Sahara dust clouds. We're talking very, very fine particles which are generally invisible. So that was data from one of the sensors installed around the site on the 24th of September. Next one. And what you've got, this is my penultimate slide, be pleased to hear. The results from the sensors, this is my assessment, okay? The concentrations of the particles and the dust particles vary at different locations. This highlights the nature of dust peaks because you might well be standing in one part of Gallingale, no problem at all. You might find that it's very localized and somewhere else, somebody might be experiencing a problem. They're intense but short-lived incidents. They can be very localized. They're often picked up on one sensor and not the others. And finally, it's still an ongoing issue. Is it possible to go back to slide? Yeah, okay. The other conclusion we come to, and I was discussing this, I think this came up yesterday with Mark and with Claire. These might not be dust peaks alone. The conclusion I've come to is it might not be just hydrogen sulfide. What we believe could be happening, is that right? We're in the very early stages. We believe the problem could be sulfur dioxide, but we've got to search for evidence. What we're looking to finding is, looking through the EA reports, they only started reporting sulfur dioxide in about July or something recently. And what we're looking for, I found evidence that where there is a peak of the particulate matter, some of these peaks also happen to coincide with peaks of sulfur dioxide. So what I'm thinking is there could be something going on in the air, whereby the sulfur dioxide, more so perhaps than the hydrogen sulfide, is mixing with other gases, reducing secondary particles, PM 2.5, the little small ones we don't like them at all. So what could be happening is these peaks might not be solely inert dust from the site. They could be PM 2.5. Okay. You go forward a bit, okay, and go, okay, that's the end, you'll be pleased to hear. Well, the beginning of the end, right? Well, the end of the beginning, I don't know. So just a reminder, I've only referred to ambient or outdoors air quality. Don't get me started on indoors air quality, because when I started off in the world of air quality, the first thing I did, silly person, I set up with one aim, is to find out what the air was like in South East London where I live. So I put an air monitor indoors, the levels fluctuated. I did something very silly then, it's a very, very silly thing I did. I took the air monitor outdoors. Oh my God. Sometimes I noticed the air quality was worse, sometimes it was better. And that got me thinking, why is it sometimes different indoors to sometimes outdoors, which Stephen I know has mentioned. And so what I would say is indoor air quality is a topic in its own right. The air quality and the pollutants will behave completely different indoors than they will outdoors for a number of reasons. Anyway, thanks for listening. Oh, thanks for inviting me, by the way. Whether you'll invite me back, I'm not quite sure, but we're going to go there. But it's quite interesting because I've been involved now for about 5 months behind the scenes, and it's been I've been involved in a number of community groups. I said to a couple of guys earlier on, this is probably one of the more challenging, I don't use the word project, endeavours I've been involved in. And, you know, I'd like to thank particularly Mick for inviting me, support we get from the other guys. Thank Mark Warren in particular, because what Mark has done, and I think he's actually been one of the unsung heroes, he's actually installed the monitors I built. And, you know, it's something whereby we can now see live data, but only from the particulate matter side of things. Anyway, so I'll shut up now, and thanks for listening. Any questions, please? From the back, go on. I didn't play up this show in the audience.
It's not here today, it's not very well.
Not right.
So multiple messages. So could someone raise the point of missing PM10 24-hour value? They seem consistently action.
Yes, I think, yes, one of my concerns was, and I went through this, I've chatted to Mick quite a lot about this, is my concern, well, you've got this dilemma, okay, you've got a dilemma. Can we go back to the slide with a piece? It's a dilemma, okay? That's the one, right. So the dilemma of all this is, which is worse? Okay. Is it worth to breathe in a lot over a short period? Or is it worse to breathe in a slightly elevated level over a long period? And either no one knows or no one wants to say. So, and the thing that I'm concerned about is you get periods where you get elevated raised readings over a 24-hour period. They exceed the recommended thresholds, but the EA just seem to ignore it, Claire. And I don't know, I sort of know why, And if I was in their position, I think I might do that as well, because I think they're understating the source of the problem, because really, no one knows what the real impact, longer term, of what you're breathing in, whether it's the gases or the particulate matter. I don't want to sound rude here, but I think maybe with the hydrogen sulfide, it's being used by the EA to cover up other reasons or other threats which could be as serious or equally more serious. Because to me, there are two fundamental things missing from all this. Okay? And what I don't see is any data relating to indoor air quality, which may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing, I don't know. But on a more, from my point of view, what we need to do, it's no good saying there's a dust peak, there's a peak, or whatever it is. What is it? No one seems to want to analyse what these particles are, and more importantly, not just what the particles are, but what could they, maybe from the site, bacteria, as Claire's background, and maybe it's toxins, I don't know. No one seems to want to do some research on what's attaching themselves to these particles. It could also be, and this is just a hunch I have, it's not based on evidence, it's more a hunch, that when you're breathing in these particles, the PM 2.5, the little particles, could be acting as a kind of pathway, and they could be mixing and bringing in other toxins into your bodies. Because what Mick and I often discuss, and this is where I think possibly things are being missed. Now, again, to come back to the tin Webb stool, the bleeding obvious. When we're breathing in the air, we're not breathing in hydrogen sulfide on its own. We're breathing in a whole range of mixtures of gases and particles. And I think what needs to be done perhaps is to move to be saying, in Silverdale, you're breathing in a somewhat unique and potentially serious mix. Should they be looking at the effects of a mixture of gases and particles, rather than just looking at here's sulfide, here's sulfides, here's nitrogen, here's particles? Shouldn't there be a more of a holistic approach? So we've had that discussion on several occasions, Chair. So, sorry, any more questions? Go on, yes. I don't know is the answer to that one. I purposely stay out of politics and away from the, I would imagine that there's probably different reasons why they don't want to engage with you on it. So there's a,
how can this information get to the people that need to use it then without campaign? That's really my question. What is it? How is it going to help us?
It would get a better understanding of what you're breathing in, and are there any other possible toxins or harmful substances that could be affecting you, because some of the symptoms you're suffering may not just be solely due to the hydrogen sulfide.
So to give us an impetus to just go it.
That's right, yes, and it would be it's very straightforward to get the particles analysed. I've had people offer to do it. I charge you 500 quid, mind you, because it's got to be done in a controlled environment. You just can't go and dig up a sample of soil, put it in a lunch box, put it in your fridge, mark it soil, do not eat. Send it off to be, analysed. It has to be done in a certain way, authorised labs. And what I'm not seeing is any desire to get those samples of particles suspended in the air or soil samples. I don't see any desire to do that.
Also, just to add to that, obviously the hydrogen sulfide, we're well aware of that because that's what we smell. But looking at the PhD fingerprint data in Silverdale and surrounding areas, we have a lung cancer and respiratory disease in excess of about 50%, I believe it was. And this was even when compared to other similar socioeconomic areas that had coal mining, so that was taken out as a variable. And so we've got this lung cancer, we've got respiratory diseases, but in adults as well. And that means there's a missing puzzle piece here. Now, the respiratory harm of particulate matter is well documented. So it probably is the case that whilst the hydrosulfide what we're measuring on stone, it's probably the particulate matter that's the mechanism that's causing the harm in adults, right? So that's why it's all building the picture of this cocktail of pollutants that we're subject to.
Yes, you're right, because what I do is I read through loads of reports, and unlike hydrogen sulfide, there is a wealth of information which links increased levels of particulate matter to basically two things. It's not a pleasant subject, but to premature death and to people and to their health. And there are studies carried out, long-term studies. If you want to read one particular one, it's called the 6 City Study with a team led by Douglas Dockery. And what they did there was they looked at, this is something that should be happening in my view. They looked at the records of the pollutant levels in 6 cities. They then mapped that onto how many people were dying prematurely. And they then came up with a link and said that in the more polluted areas, the likelihood was that people's life expectancy would be reduced by saying either a certain number of years or months. It's a very painful subject, I know, but it has to be talked about because what you're breathing in may not become evident maybe for 5 or 10 years' time. And if I was to come back in 5 or 10 years' time, some of you might not be here. That's why I do it, because I believe that there's a fundamental air pollution inequality, and certain communities, I believe, if this was the southeast of England, this would not be happening. It's all around it, it would not be happening. Give me more, Mike. Give me more for what it is. I wish I've never got involved in there. I wish some. Why did I ever get involved? But the reason is because I care about particularly people, young people, you know, and I think what's happening in Silverdale should never be allowed to happen or continue to happen, and the authorities know it. And I think it comes to one word, and the word is fear. I think they're worried about that, you know, the effects, and no doubt about it. I think if they did it, they won't collect, they won't analyse the particles. They deliberately don't mention particulate matter because particulate matter is perhaps one of the most contentious and controversial areas of air quality. Because in the whole world, it probably is the single deadliest reason for people's premature death or illnesses. Forget hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, I'm convinced, is a far more serious issue, but you won't hear it mentioned, and you can probably work out, because I'm looking why it's not mentioned. It's far too controversial and contentious. That's my opinion. And the communities that I've supported, and yours community is, I think, particularly relevant. And if I didn't think it was important, I wouldn't be here today. Sorry. Sorry, I do get a bit. Sorry. I do get a bit emotional because I read about the health and environmental impacts. You push me.
Really interesting what you said about possibly bacteria piggybacking.
Yes, yeah. Possibly, yeah.
Possibly, but that's leading me to think now. Obviously, viruses are much smaller, but I'm thinking of the way to flu spread and COVID spread.
Yeah.
Therefore, there may be variability.
There are.
In where people are standing, what they're exposed to, whether they're indoors.
Yeah.
And wearing masks. So
Yeah.
if you've got a highly an environment that has got a high gas, high particulate matter.
There was it. I'll get a mask.
I It may more exposed to more,
Made of crop. No, I'm a great believer in crop. I try and break it down into manageable chunks. It's too much, what's the word, too much technical. I'm not a very technical person. Okay, so what I've done is I've got my mask here. And when I looked at the filter inside my mask, so take the mask here, I've got the filter inside it, and I've got the filter inside my mask. And the filter has on it, in the corner there, PM 2.5. I thought, oh, but then I thought, that's not good really, because the actual particle sizes of the coronavirus are much smaller. But they fall under the ultra fine particles. But yes, maybe I've not been so safe as I think I was. But you're right. The particles themselves, it's the size of the particles which is perhaps relevant, because the smaller they are, the further they will be absorbed into your body. And the likelihood is, and I've had several conversations with scientists and leading doctors who will very unhappy, and they won't be quoted publicly on the possible long-term effects of the smaller particles in particular, no pun intended, because I think it's because it's a whole very, very contentious, and what helped me, I suppose, understand the issue, and this is where Sean and Mary-Louise come in. As soon as I saw your heat map, I thought to myself, oh, this is what's happening. So because the thing that's mystified me, love it, never would have children, but it mystified me is how on earth is a heavier than air gas travelling 5, maybe 10 miles? And I don't think it is. I think perhaps what's happening is the gases are reacting in the air, producing the secondary particles. Now, the secondary particles or particulate matter comprises, it's a bit complex, but basically you put it into 3 types of particles. You've got solid particles, you've got liquid droplets, water, and you've got solid particles with a liquid coating. So what could be happening, and again, Claire and Mark and I have been discussing this in great detail, that they could be bonding, we think, isn't it? It could be bonding onto, because your background being the bacteriological side, so some of the gases or particles could be bonding because hydrogen sulfide shouldn't be able to travel that far. So I think what could be happening, there's only a theory of mine, that the smaller particles, can we go back to the PM 2.5 a minute? Possible to go back to PM 2.5? Go back again? That's right. So because they're very small, they can travel for miles, they will stay in the air for typically 5 to 10 days, and during that time they're constantly changing and evolving. You've got a moving air mass full of various gases. So I think what could be happening, it's not the hydrogen sulfide that's being carried as such, but maybe some of the molecules are bonding with the other particles in the air and traveling, and particulate matter is probably the traveling mechanism that these particles are bonded to. That's only a theory, and it's trying to understand what's going on in the air, because that's what struck me from the heat map, is how on earth how is it happening? How is it going that far? And it cannot be just gases alone, I think. But the problem is that in the particulate matter, it's a very, very complex area, a very contentious area. And what I've tried to do is to distill down what I've sort of taught myself and what I've taught other people over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm sorry, it's not a straightforward topic and it's not a good news topic, but I think you deserve, because you're all intelligent people, and I think you deserve to be told the truth, and I don't think you are being told the truth. And that's my concern. Sorry.
Just moving back a step, when you're saying that the EA are not monitoring these particulates and breaking them down, is it possible for an individual
Yes, I've had offers from at least one lab who will do that for you. It'll cost you dear. You're looking at £500 if you want it done properly. It's not cheap because it needs specialists, and Stephen will probably know this from the microscope point of view. Analysing it is a very, very difficult job. Is that right, Stephen? Because have you been down this route?
That's just as it's tip.
The fact is that we analysing particulates in the chemical process is extremely complicated because not only have we got we've got the evidence of the interaction. So you're saying that PM2.5 are second particles, they're not always second.
No, they're not always. No,
So, for instance, on profiling tiles, every time you break, you eliminate particles by line particles forward. The line will break, friction will from the tiles. They can be combined with other material to identify specific required to monitor the required. So, the color of that. And then actually, then we can play that. They don't want to do that. I pushed them a number of times last monitor proper collection and that one. Not one line. Don't want to do it. Because to do that, I suspect that somebody will find instead of using that. Measuring people's homes, now I do appreciate why you do it, and I feel the same myself. You smell the stench, perfect. It's like things that burn, whatever. How we manage those things, along with volatile. The fancy high-end chain line is a video only takes one specified information happens at the hand with you replicate yourself and your body replicating not switching on. So one that finds that one part in the body and the overview of the time will be itself there is no safe level. One part, one.
You can just say yes, I'll come back. It's safe level, it's a bit of a misnomer because what it's been judged from studies is that there is no such thing as a threshold which is safe. Because it depends on the individual particles as well. The other thing you've got to muddy the water as well with particulate matter is not all the air that you breathe in Silverdale would have originated in Silverdale. So you've got to remember that the particles and the gases in the air mass could be travelling in from elsewhere, and trying to distinguish where they originated can be a bit of a problem as well, because you get local pollutants, what we call transboundary pollutants. And I started off my sort of journey when I lived through a pollution incident, and I tracked the particles in real time as they were moving across London, and they go like 9 or 10 miles. That was on a still day, and I was able to track the particles as they moved out towards Bexley, out towards Lewisham, and down towards Sevenoaks in Kent as well. And to me, that's when I began to understand a bit more about how far they can travel. And of course, as they're traveling, they're evolving. Imagine the gases are moving as well. So the particles are being formed, they're joining together into bigger particles as well. So they may start off as smaller particles, they could then change into bigger particles. As the gases evolve and mix at different heights, because what you've got in the air, and again, we're discussing this with Mark and Claire recently, when you look at the air around us, it's moving at different speeds and different directions at different heights. You get eddying or currents, like the mixing happens as well. And the thing that fascinates me as an impartial observer is how you get one localized hotspot someone reports. Someone said, well, I never smell anything. And literally, my approach is, my revelation came from, my approach is I put clusters of sensors or networks in an area. What you'll find is that the readings at the front of someone's house will be completely different to the readings at the back of their house and the side of their house. I also put very radical this. I think of dogs and children as well. I put sensors at different heights. Because you're right, absolutely right, because studies have shown, and there was one study I read recently to do with the emissions from tailpipes. Sorry, exhaust, sorry, it's American stuff. Exhaust pipes, not tailpipes. I apologise for all American on you now. Because you think of it logically, if you've got an exhaust pipe, right, the gas is going to be much more concentrated for a vertically challenged person. I didn't say tall, I didn't say tall, I said vertically challenged. So those studies have shown, because of the gases from the vehicle exhaust systems, as they get higher, they're going to be less concentrated. So children in particular and pets will be more affected because they're lower to the ground. And the further away you are from the curb, then the gas will be dispersed and the concentrations will be lower. Again, the score of the being obvious, really, isn't it, logically? And so what I think you've got to look at is different heights, and we found this. I got Mark to climb up a ladder for me, installed a fake sim, which is God bless him, he did. And because I wanted to see what it was like at different heights, because I'm obsessed with putting up. I'm obsessed. I don't care if I got a problem. I don't care. I'm obsessed with particulate matter because I want to understand what the concentrations are like at different heights. And generally, sometimes of the day, the concentrations are higher above the ground. Sometimes they are higher lower down to the ground. And so, therefore, I think with the Environment Agency, they are the fundamental problem is, you see, they're not out to find pollution. Bit of a radical statement, right? They're out to measure the ambient or background air quality. And you don't want to start looking for problems, because once you start looking for a problem and you identify a problem, you then have to do something about the problem. And so what their approach is, they will put a mobile water facility in a car park. Who lives in a car park? Well, you can chuck at your house, of course, you've got space in front of it, won't go there. So I understand why they've got to put in a car park or a pumping station, but they don't seem to be putting the monitors, they're very radical, where people live, where people eat, where people sleep, where people shop, where people work. So I think what they would find is, if they were to put their monitoring sites somewhere else, the readings would be completely different. I know they're restricted, Nick, do you know what I mean? Because they, with the power supplies,
security, also the inlets have to be well applied.
Yes, because only tall people breathe in pollutants, yeah, short people don't. Sorry, yeah, no, sorry. So yeah, there are restrictions, but I think what I think they could be doing perhaps a bit more, but they're not looking for pollution hotspots. They're looking at the ambient or the background indoors air quality. That's the job of the regulator. They want to find out what it's like in the general area. And the problem is with gases, as you all know, with particles as well, you get local hotspots where it will suddenly be much more concentrated. And so I found from being on that side of the building, if I measure the particles over there, it'll be completely different, because it varies so much with the air currents, what is going on, the concentration of gases. It is not a straightforward topic. And sometimes I sit home and I think, oh my God, it just does my brain in. So what I think, I promised is that I'm not going to have any more communities after this one. I've just had it up to here because there's only so much I can do. And that's why I don't generally post on social media. Yeah. Or if I do, you'll spot me as robbing banks. I know people miss the humour, doesn't robbing banks, or it was David Greenwood, Dawn Underwood, his long-serving partner, and their two children, Sam and Emma. Sam and Emma? And Heidi, the dog, yeah. So that's just my humour, because I've posted it myself in the past, and it's got me into all kinds of trouble. Because, I'm sorry, it's just, I can't help it. It's just, I'm just a rather eccentric southerner. But you know, you've got to have us on the team. It's written into the, you must have one slightly eccentric sublayer on the team. It's mandated, it's got to happen. And so, any other questions? Sorry, while I'm here, go on. If you want to ask me anything else, any other questions at all? Go on, yeah.
When these particulates are floated through the air, do you actually land on the ground and go to the soil?
Yes, they will. Depends upon a number of things, depending on the size of the particles. Because the bigger they are, the more likely they are to fall to ground as dust fall more quickly. They will get into the soil, so therefore, if you wanted to find the impact of Wally's quarry, you would need to have two approaches. Not you personally, but the two approaches is you need to take some soil samples near the site boundary and further from the site. And you would also have to collect some of the particles suspended in the air as well. But yes, it's the PM10. These are my favourites. I don't like the PM1. My favourite is PM10. And what I specialise in is I keep monitoring on, I've got the sensors linked to an app on my phone. So as a incident occurs, I normally badger poor Eau Claire or Mark to say, you know, what's going on. So yes, the larger particles are more likely to fall to ground more quickly. Because basic gravity takes over and other conditions as well. Or if it goes very still, they will then drop to the ground.
So will that affect the quality of the soil?
It will. Yes.
So when green bees in the garden.
Yes. The particles, depending on what they've got attached or bonding onto them, if that's going into the, well, it will fall to the ground, it will go into your soil, go into your vegetables, and then you'll eat them. It could have an impact. The only way you discover that is you would have to get some soil samples taken and analysed of your soil to find out what exactly it is. Yes.
Right, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for listening.
Does anyone desperately want to go to the quarry now, or are you happy to do that? Excellent. No. It was,
You mentioned the past. Sorry, no, sorry.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I don't know. Is the bar still open?
Was it all right then?
Yeah, that was really, really
Yeah, if you want to grab a drink, please do. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. And any questions, you know our faces now. Feel free to ask, and I'll be hanging around for a little bit, so you can come and grab me. But thank you.
Thank you.
Loan me her Zoom account, and it's done the test today. To the speakers. Darren Woolen, he does the he's our drone operator. He's also part of it. Thank you, and thank you on Zoom. Hi everyone, thank you.
I'll go put all the chairs back.